was October 8th, 2003, when the very first issue of Robert Kirkman's The Walking Dead graphic novel crawled its way onto our shelves. 20 years later, this small, ambitious comic about a Kentucky sheriff's deputy trying to survive in a world besieged by the undead has amassed millions of fans, multiple novels, numerous video games, and several record-breaking television series. The Walking Dead and its collection of characters are now household names which have firmly left their blood-covered imprints on multiple mediums of entertainment and art, and will forever be remembered for harboring the early 21st century's cultural obsession with the infamous capital Z zombies. However, behind all of its fame and influence, Kirkman's The Walking Dead remains an impressive piece of storytelling art that deserves a thorough inspection of its creation, characters, themes, messages, and overall effect. And as we approach the series' 20th anniversary, I wanted to analyze and express my thoughts, appreciation, and utter love for one of my favorite stories ever told. So brace yourselves as we enter the dark, twisted, beautiful world of The Walking Dead. On October 1st, 1968, American-Canadian film director George Andrew Romero released his directorial debut, Night of the Living Dead, which not only received vast financial and critical acclaim, but rebirthed one of popular culture's most famous monsters, the zombie. Before Romero's vision tore its way onto the silver screen, zombies were instead associated with the Haitian and African folklore concept of undead souls enslaved within their own bodies, forever at the mercy of their masters, who commanded their every move. However, it wasn't until Romero added one key ingredient to these undead ghouls that they became the zombies we know them as today, their everlasting hunger for human flesh. Ten years later, on November 30th, 1978, Robert Kirkman was born in the city of Lexington, in the state of Kentucky, in the United States of America. While immensely fearful of horror films as a child, it was only in his teenage years and after graduating from high school that Kirkman's appreciation for zombie films began to arise. In particular, his love for Romero's Dead films, 1985's Day of the Dead being his personal favorite of the trilogy. These gruesome tales of survival and their thematic introspection of humanity and society struck a chord with Kirkman. Yet there was something missing for the eventual writer. For him, like many other viewers, myself included, Kirkman always wanted more. He wanted to see what happened to the characters that survived the film's events. Where did they go next? How much farther did they make it? And of course, did humanity ever truly recover from the undead epidemic? These questions lingered in Kirkman's mind during the 1990s and into the turn of the century when he began his career as a comic book writer. At the age of 21, Kirkman partnered with his childhood friend Tony Moore to publish his first independent comic book, Battle Pope, on June 1st, 2000, with Kirkman acting as writer and Moore as its artist. The book provided Kirkman with an avenue to explore one of his other favorite genres, superheroes. The story in question followed a debaucherous Pope assigned by God to save a saint from the clutches of Satan. And Jesus Christ tags along too, of course. To put it lightly, Kirkman wanted to make a loud debut into the comic book world. And while the story's more comedic nature is rather juvenile and indicative of Kirkman's age at the time, even from the very first issue, he couldn't help but include his favorite undead monsters in some shape or form, in this case being the zombie twins. However, the series went on to only last 14 issues before Kirkman began working with American comic book publisher Image Comics, and developed another superhero property, Invincible. And while Invincible would go on to great success of its own after its release on January 22nd, 2003, Kirkman already had the urge to explore a different kind of story. One that didn't rely on fantastical characters and whimsical plot lines. He wanted to do something, as he later put it, heartfelt, quiet, and personal. And with that, the armies of the dead began marching back into the forefront of Kirkman's mind. His initial pitch to Skybound for a story revolving around the undead was quite far and away from what we know as The Walking Dead today, however. Sometime in 2002, Moore and Kirkman conceptualized a story set in the distant future of the 27th century, where an off-world mineral is discovered to contain the ability to raise the dead. Pitched with the title Dead Planet, Kirkman was already pushing for a story to scratch that itch he had had since his love for the genre first blossomed, for a story to be the zombie movie that never ends. The pitch even included a dreadlocked, sword-wielding character then known as Michelle. However, this pitch was rejected by Image, and Kirkman returned to the drawing board. Dropping the science fiction angle completely and diving headfirst into making the story a more grounded, real character study, Kirkman figured he may as well return directly to the source of the genre, directly to George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which had famously fallen into the public domain after its theatrical distributor failed to sufficiently copyright the film. Thus, Kirkman pitched the idea of a semi-direct continuation of Romero's original picture. The comic would adopt the same title, be set in the same world and time period of the 1960s, and importantly maintain Night of the Living Dead's black and white color scheme. Cleverly, Kirkman figured this would not only make printing cheaper, ensuring its early run would last just that little bit longer than a colored graphic novel, but also that the black and white coloring would allow for the drama, weight, and emotion of the story not to be overshadowed by copious amounts of brightly colored gore. So a 5-page story sample was produced for Image, focusing on the quaint small-town family of Rick, Carol, and Carl. Co-founder of Image Comics, Jim Valentino, suggested, however, that because all of the characters in Kirkman's story were almost completely unrelated to Romero's original narrative, that he should simply change the name of the story and make it his own property. So yet again, Kirkman returned to the drawing board and rejigged the treatment. The title of The Walking Dead was born, and Kirkman outlined the first story arc, which would revolve around Rick and his family taking over an abandoned high school as their new home. The story would explore how far Rick would go to protect his family, and eventually his battle to retake the world for the living and rebuild civilization. And while it wasn't overtly stated in his original proposal, Kirkman had in mind a story that would eventuate into a sprawling epic. It wasn't a story that would be built on cheap scares or pulpy gore, but one that thrived on character and change. One that dived deep into the human response to such a horrifying catastrophe and the extremities of survival. In other words, The Walking Dead was to be a character drama with some zombies in it, not the other way around. However, his brief story sample depicting Rick and Carol's first encounter with an undead ghoul that barges into their Pennsylvanian home was rejected on the basis of it being a lame horror movie opening that lacked any sufficient edge of originality. And when it came down to it, the decision makers at Image just couldn't envision such a dramatic, grounded interpretation of a zombie apocalypse being a viable story to sell. So, one more time, like a shambling corpse, Kirkman returned to his all-too-familiar drawing board and scrapped his original opening. This time, he updated the concept to instead be set in the present day of 2003, shifted the setting from Pennsylvania to his own home state of Kentucky, and opened the story with protagonist Rick Grimes, a small-town sheriff's deputy, being wounded in a shootout and awaking months later from a coma to find that the world had fallen victim to the zombie plague, leaving him with one immediate goal: finding his family. Oh, and he also changed Carol's name to Laurie because Carol and Carl sounded just a bit too similar. However, much in the vein of his own post-apocalyptic characters and how they would do anything to survive, Kirkman had one more sly trick up his sleeve to ensure Image would accept his proposal. Just as they were about to reject his final pitch, Kirkman slipped in the idea that eventually the story would reveal that the undead apocalypse was formulated by extraterrestrials as a precursor to their invasion, and that the novel would culminate in an all-out war between humans and aliens. This streak of deceptive ingenuity saw Image finally greenlight the project, and on October 8th, 2003, The Walking Dead clawed its way into the world for all to see with Volume 1, Days Gone By. When discussing The Walking Dead, it's easy to find oneself lost in a myriad of themes and ideas. Over its 193-issue run, The Walking Dead has explored numerous facets of the human condition. Whether it is guilt, love, depression, hope, fear, sanity, tyranny, leadership, justice, parenthood, life, death, and many, many more ethical dilemmas revolving around these extremities of emotion and experience. In our exploration of the series, we will touch on all of these ideas at play, and put the pieces together to discover what truly lies at the core of Kirkman's undead epic. Something immediate to note about The Walking Dead's beginning is its striking resemblance to Danny Boyle and Alex Garland's own zombie film 28 Days Later, which was released just 1 year prior to the publication of Kirkman's post-apocalyptic drama. Both stories begin with their protagonist waking up in a hospital to find that the world is in ruin. Many readers at the time questioned this odd similarity, but Kirkman was adamant that their resemblance was pure coincidence and that the idea was, in his own words, mind stolen from him. And it's not hard to believe that this was the case, given that both projects had a lengthy production process, which ran parallel to one another. What many aren't aware of, though, is that this opening isn't original to either one of these stories, and what differentiates Garland and Kirkman's intent with this opening is that Garland purposely wrote the first act of 28 Days Later as a tribute to John Wyndham's classic 1951 post-apocalyptic novel, The Day of the Triffids, which also opens with its protagonist missing the early stages of the apocalypse due to being bedridden in hospital. However, while Garland adopted this opening knowingly, Kirkman claimed to have never even heard of the novel before coming up with the idea. So really, it's more like Kirkman has an odd knack for mind stealing from other people. Regardless of coincidences though, the recurrence of such a concept is a testament to its viability and strength as an opening, immediately bonding the audience and its protagonist through a shared experience in which we discover and explore a post-apocalyptic world together. Rick Grimes himself begins the story as a sort of clean slate character. He's a brave, protecting and serving policeman in a small town. He has a loving wife and a young son, and by all accounts, he's a kind, honourable and caring man. And while his straightforward nature makes him both likeable and fitting as an audience surrogate, it's his rather regular good man archetype that also makes him perfect for what Kirkman was setting out to achieve with this story. It makes him the perfect test subject to study change, to explore the question of what happens when you take a good-hearted, loving family man and put him through hell. It's a simple yet effective basis to build this story upon. And naturally, what instigates our relationship with Rick before anything else on this journey is fear. Kirkman preludes the collected edition of Volume 1 with the bold statement that The Walking Dead isn't truly a horror novel, and its primary goal is not to scare its readers. However, I do think these words downplay just how much horror is crucial to The Walking Dead, particularly in its beginning. After all, the very first features that make Rick a tangible character are his vulnerabilities. Not only is he not invincible, but he is also incredibly fearful. Volume 1 frequently depicts a Rick that is frightened out of his mind, and oftentimes intensely emotional. It is this sort of humanizing that goes hand in hand with the story's horror. Without the scares and thrills of the story, Rick's vulnerabilities wouldn't be so clear and relatable. And without Rick's vulnerabilities, the scares and thrills wouldn't be so effective. Kirkman later readjusted his words and clarified that he greatly respects the zombie horror genre and is pleased if the story does scare people, but even still he continues to refer to the horror and character drama almost as mutually exclusive, which undercuts the importance of that horror to the characterization he holds in such high regard. After all, the world of The Walking Dead is a horrifying one, and the only way to truly explore the characters who inhabit it is to explore its horror. Much of the early success of presenting such a world is also to be credited to Tony Moore's beautiful artwork, which produces some of the most striking horror imagery to come out of the zombie genre. The desolate landscapes carry with it a sense of unsettling loneliness. The melancholic silence in many of the lingering panels provide the sense that the world has become a graveyard for humanity, with ravaged houses and silent skyscrapers acting as our tombstones. The undead corpses themselves are drawn with an alluring concoction of foulness, danger, and sadness. The sheer amount of variation, detail, and gothic-like edge Moore's drawings boast solidify The Walking Dead as a gritty and mature story even sooner than the writing does, signifying to readers just how far and away this material is than what the pair had previously done with Battle Pope. The black and white color scheme itself only accentuates the idea that Rick hasn't just awoken into a new world, he's awoken into a nightmare, a world where color and life has been drained from existence and we are only left with survival and the dead. However, of course, the artwork is only one half of the picture. Kirkman's writing is just as confident and complex as Moore's drawings, swiftly establishing an intriguing dichotomy at the heart of The Walking Dead. Here we have a world that, in its visual design, its haunted by catastrophe atmosphere, and its monstrous inhabitants, is seemingly devoid of all life and hope. Yet our protagonist's very first goal is one driven by life and hope more than, arguably, any other human motivation: to find his loved ones. It's a primal human desire which is only heightened in the face of a world that seems so against it. Rick is alone, even when surrounded by hordes of the undead. They no longer harbor any ounce of love, fear, compassion, or warmth. No matter where he is, Rick is completely isolated from human connection. And that kind of utter and complete detachment from anything of comfort or familiarity is exactly the kind of scenario that can make any mature adult feel as though they're a child crying out for their parents. So herein lies the first inklings of the true emotional core of The Walking Dead: humanity. Even before Rick meets another living human, the story and its characters are already being motivated by a drive for humans and their connections. And it is the immense odds that are stacked against that motivation which only make it more engaging, thrilling, and of course, entertaining. The first characters that Rick does meet then are not psychopaths or violent gangs. They are instead some of the kindest and most helpful that anyone could have hoped for. Morgan Jones and his son Dwayne, a name which is in tribute to the actor Dwayne Jones, who portrayed the key role of Ben in Night of the Living Dead. Morgan's visual design was even based off of a young Morgan Freeman, just to make him seem that bit more friendly. It is the closing panels of issue 1, however, that I think truly solidify our engagement with this story, when Rick returns to one of the very first zombies he had the misfortune of meeting, the Bicycle Girl. More than any other zombie he had seen until this point, the Bicycle Girl instilled less the palpable panic and fear that those in the hospital did, and more of a sense of tragedy. Rick's initial meeting with it was the first time he had a chance to soak in the fact that these aren't just mindless monsters. Once their ability to consume one's flesh is removed, the veil of fear is stripped back and it becomes immediately clear that these were people. People with their own hobbies, friends, families, loves, faults, and dreams. Living, breathing people whose every ounce of humanity was torn away with as much brutal indifference as the flesh was from their bones, leaving nothing but an awful, lumbering shell of who they once were, condemned to helplessly writhe in a cold existence. Her eyes stare into Rick's almost as if they were in agony, screaming for help, and Rick can only break down in the face of it. It's a memorable, humanizing, and impactful moment. And by the end of the issue, as Rick is moments from beginning his journey towards Atlanta to find his family, he returns to the girl and puts her down. It's a moment of mercy, of course, but more importantly, it's the first true indicator of Rick's most key attribute, his strength. Rick is returning to a site not many people would and facing the most tragic circumstances this new world can present him with, and he is standing firm. He wipes away his tears, composes himself, and continues on, more resolute in his journey than ever, rejecting the worst of this new world and fighting on for the best of it. And the way in which Kirkman allows these moments multiple panels to linger without dialogue delivers an added layer of depth and importance to them. It allows us to soak in this world and its array of emotions the same way our characters must. This isn't to say, however, that Kirkman's dialogue isn't of note. The decent-sized cast is made up of a number of distinct voices that are all plausible and engaging in their own manner. If they're not furthering the plot, then their dialogue is expanding upon the development and characterization of the cast. Most of Kirkman's characters are multifaceted. They each get a chance to smile, laugh, and comfort one another, but also to get frustrated, sad, and angry. Donna, for instance, a relatively minor character, has a nurturing attitude towards many of the other members in their small camp outside of Atlanta, being genuinely interested and caring about their well-being. But at the same time, she can care a little too much, causing her great petty frustration over things like Amy's quote-unquote unchristian behavior. Or there's Jim, another relatively minor addition to the cast, but his lack of dialogue lends him an entirely unique and distinct character to the rest of them. And when he finally does have something to say, it's all the more impactful. Having an innate comedic streak in him also allows Kirkman to be able to incorporate a realistic sense of humor to his characters. Even if it's only a small passing remark, Kirkman injects just enough doses of wit, self-aware or not, to the characters to give them a sense of levity and humanity that you would expect anybody in real life to speak like. And it's this balance of natural dialogue with depthful characterization which makes his cast so likable and memorable. Then pairing this with Moore's detailed artwork, and the story comes to life effortlessly. The pacing of the volume wastes no time either, so much so there are instances in which Kirkman glazes over moments that could have used greater attention, such as when Rick first returns to his home and finds it not only in a wreck, but abandoned, with his family nowhere to be found. What would later become a heart-wrenching dramatic moment in AMC's television adaptation, the comic instead has Rick briefly walk through the house with a rather mild-mannered sense of defeat, and nothing more. Even Kirkman himself has noted that there are sequences that he likely would have spent more time on if he had written the story today, like when Rick puts his wedding ring back on for the first time since he had been shot. However, despite the few moments that the volume does rush over, the brisk pacing is largely a benefit to the story. Kirkman's characterization and dialogue is able to keep up with the pace well enough that it rarely feels as though it's suffering because of it. To bring Rick's search for Laurie and Carl to a surprising end in issue 2 is also a heartwarming way to maintain readers' investment, highlighting the importance of character, humanity, and hope in The Walking Dead. Kirkman believes that the happy ending to an issue so early in the series was always indicative of the kind of heart that The Walking Dead has. And this is exactly the reason I was gripped by this story so early on. The way in which it takes us through such pain, horror, and hopelessness, all to serve its moments of genuine warmth and love, making them all the more satisfying and real. It's not a stretch to say that if anything, this balance of dark and light is just an extreme reflection of everyone's lives every single day. Nothing stays continually perfect and happy for anyone. There's always going to be something to drag us down, big or small, externally or internally. But there's always going to be something that brings us up again too. And The Walking Dead is the epitome of that cycle. I'm also quite a marshmallow when it comes to these things, so I can't help but tear up when Rick's family is reunited. Despite all of the darkness that was and will be, there'll always be this moment, and moments like it. However, while humanity is the source of hope and love in The Walking Dead, so do they illustrate the decay of this post-apocalyptic world, and are, particularly for these first 4 volumes, the subjects for the exploration of loss. For generations upon generations now, humans have largely only existed within our contemporary society. There are jobs, laws, and expectations already pre-built for us by the time that we are born. Our lives, identities, and purpose are largely, if not completely, formulated around everything that society maintains for us. After all, society has become what it has in many ways to cater to how us humans function, to provide us with meaning, direction, purpose. But what happens when that society goes away? What happens when those jobs and laws and expectations, all that we've ever known and relied on to keep us moving, washes away? What then is our purpose? For someone like Rick, that purpose is immediate and hasn't much changed. It's his family. They are, and already were, his reason for living and breathing every day. It is merely the means of how he provides for and protects that family that has changed. However, what if someone doesn't have a purpose so immediately identifiable? What if someone's identity is solely reliant on the society that is now gone? In this case, that someone is Rick's old partner in the sheriff's department, Shane Walsh. Prior to the collapse, Shane seemingly had no romantic partner, and certainly had no family that he could turn to like Rick could. For all intents and purposes, when society fell, Shane would have nothing. But by happenstance, when the dead began to rise up and all of those pillars of our lives began to fall apart, Rick was in a coma, and Laurie and Carl were alone and vulnerable. Suddenly, Shane did have a purpose. he had a family of his own. And in their initial frenzy to cling on to something comforting and familiar, to something normal in an abnormal situation, Shane and Laurie slept together, despite them knowing Rick was still alive and that he very well could wake up again at any time. Their own morals and sense of being were dictated not by what remained of themselves after the collapse, but what didn't remain. For Laurie, that was human intimacy. For Shane, it was purpose. For neither of them was it an overt act of malice. Instead, it was largely a knee-jerk reaction to change, something humans are infamously sensitive to. Although it's certainly the case that Shane is a little more lewd in his intentions, given that he reveals in the flashback that opens Volume 2 that he had already had his eye on Laurie prior to the zombie epidemic, and despite knowing that it was wrong, still acted on his desires in a time when Laurie couldn't have been more vulnerable. One can assume that with the loss of so much around them, it would be easier for Shane and Laurie, if only briefly, to think that any consequences to such an action would be lost too. After traveling to Atlanta to reach Laurie's parents, Shane, Laurie, and Carl found themselves too late. The city was already overrun with the dead. So, as other latecomers converged, a small camp of survivors formulated outside of Atlanta, and due to Shane's prior occupation, it was only natural that he became their leader. Up until this point, despite society's collapse, Shane seemingly hadn't lost much in the grand scheme of things. He continued to protect and serve a small community of people, and he had gained a family. Yet I suspect that deep down, Shane not only doubted his leadership abilities from the beginning, but knew that this family wasn't truly his. Because rather than taking the group away from the city and into safer pastures where this new status quo could remain, he instead forces them to stay by the city. His thinking behind this is that any day now, the government and the military are going to come rolling over the hills to take control for him and snap society back into place, bringing all of their Monday to Friday jobs and taxes to pay with them. And if their group is closer to the city, then surely they'll be the first to be rescued. Or as some would call this plan, let's go to the Winchester, have a nice cold pint, and wait for all this to blow over. Yet, even as the weeks go by and members of the group are killed due to their proximity to the zombie-infested city, Shane maintains his stance. Perhaps if Rick hadn't returned, Shane would have had them move camp sooner, but certainly with Rick's return, Laurie and Carl weren't his family to protect anymore, and thus Shane's ultimate allegiance lay not with Laurie or Carl or the group, but to the society that he has always relied upon. To me, this implies that Shane, for the longest time, didn't want any conflict to arise with Rick. Deep down, he knew his relationship with Laurie was wrong, and if he could just hold out for society to return to the way it was, then he wouldn't have to rely on her as a source of comfort and purpose in his life. He wouldn't feel so alone. Things wouldn't have to get ugly. Through this, a hint of tragedy is peppered into Shane's character. He knows what's right and wrong. He has goodness in him. But of course his mistake was making that goodness reliant on a fantasy that was never coming true. While still unaware of Shane and Laurie's affair, one of the first matters Rick brings up to Shane upon his return is how dangerous it is for them to be so close to the city, and that they should vacate the area. Rick even privately tells Shane his early inklings that the world may never be the same again. Yet despite Rick's practical theories and plans, Shane firmly rejects all of it. And of course, this isn't because Shane particularly wants to be a leader, but because his leadership position allows him the most sure way of being saved by external powers. He is desperate to cling on to the fantasy that he will be saved, and that he won't have to face the existential reality that he's lost everything he thought he had, and that he will have to adapt and change. So really, Rick here is not exactly threatening Shane's leadership, but unknowingly threatening his life's purpose, his mental stability. And when members of the group begin to die off, Shane's guilt overwhelms him because he knows that they're only dying for his own sake. He knows it's only a matter of time before they look to Rick instead, and he knows that the likelihood of their salvation is fading by the second. After Jim is bitten in a sudden zombie attack on their camp, he asks to be left outside of the Atlanta city. Kirkman in part did this to subvert the usual killing your friend before they turn trope, which he had just done with Andrea and Amy. But it also marks an important stepping stone for the story. Jim and Amy are the first two deaths of the series. They shake the group to their core. The armada of death has truly begun, and Shane is on the cusp of his mental breakdown that will only prove just how much this world has taken from people. And as they sit Jim on the outskirts of Atlanta, they take a mournful moment to accept his demise. And then, one by one, they turn to leave, walking further and further away until they disappear into the surrounding forest, continuing on their journey with death on their minds and a path that will not be clear for a long time to come. And fittingly, the first to turn and walk this path, the first to no longer bear the sight of Jim any longer, is Shane. After these two deaths, both Rick and Laurie make reference to the fact that things will never be the same again, and they couldn't have been more correct. The descent of Shane is another element Kirkman has acknowledged that he likely would have spent longer on if he had written it today. As it stands, his decline is rapid, and extra layers of development always could have helped, but I do think the efficient setup and payoff of this storyline is part of the reason for the comic's early success. It gave people a satisfying and well-rounded idea of what The Walking Dead was going to be right from the get-go. No time wasted. The 4-panel reveal of Shane's desire for Laurie alone, without a single line of dialogue, is a wonderful example of this quick and effective style of storytelling that Kirkman utilizes early on in the series. The swift sequence of events also ends up formulating one of Rick's other notable characteristics, his infamous ability to fly off the handle at inopportune times, like when he suddenly yells at Shane and gets himself a punch in the face. It's unclear if this was a trait of Rick's before the collapse, but either way, it's not only a sign of the immense stress he is suffering in this new world, but also a signifier for how deeply passionate and powerful Rick's drive to protect his family is. And anything that tests that is likely to rile him up faster than anything else ever could. As for Shane, it's only appropriate that the final straw for him is when Laurie looks upon him with disgust, when his last true purpose and human connection is severed, and he is left with nothing except to face the selfish indifference he has inflicted upon all of them. That is when he snaps. His dreams and plans and relationships, everything that makes up his purpose for living, is gone, and as his fantasy crumbles, his fear and guilt and anger overrides any compassion or goodness he may have had left, and he turns his sights on his friend in a matter of seconds. For Shane, if the old world wasn't coming back, then maybe he can at least return to the sense of normalcy he had before Rick arrived. Shane is practically drowning in tears in this moment, and I think that's because he knows he failed Laurie, Carl, and the group. He knows he put his own salvation before theirs, and he knows that salvation is a lie. He knows he's a failure, and he doesn't deserve what he wants. But, like a frightened child crying out for their parents, he doesn't want to face what he's done. He doesn't want to accept it, and he certainly doesn't want to go through the pain of learning and adapting to a new world. He just wants what's familiar to him, regardless of his own actions. And that gaping dark void of nothingness between losing one purpose and finding another only makes him more desperate for that sense of comfort. And now, in the height of his desperation and the whirlwind of his emotions, he finds himself willing to murder his best friend for his own mental stability. In short, without a purpose, Shane is a coward, and that cowardice makes him dangerous. Before Shane can pull the trigger on Rick though, Carl arrives and fires a bullet through his neck. Unlike the swift and indifferent dispatchments of the undead, Shane's death is painfully human. His eyes flood with horror as he desperately grasps onto his last breaths of air, until the life drains from his eyes, and all of his thoughts and hopes and fears all but cease to exist. It's a contrast so striking that Carl recognizes it immediately, crying in his father's arms about how killing the living is nothing like killing the dead. Rick comforts him by saying that it never should be, son. It never should be. The dark reality here, though, is that despite Rick's words, Shane just proved that even good people, people that were once best friends, can murder one another just as savagely as the zombies themselves. That regardless of how different it feels or how hard it may be, that even though humans know the pain that they are causing, they will do it nonetheless. And of course that begs the question, does that make us worse than the zombies? After all, Rick was just proven right in training his 9-year-old son in how to use a gun. And if such violence and loss of innocence is at all necessary to survive in such a world, if that is the lesson this new world is teaching them, then there very well may come a time when killing the living is no different from killing the dead. To begin the volume with Rick and Shane working side by side, relying on one another to serve the greater good of a community, and then to end with them on opposite ends of the barrel of a shotgun, desperately clinging onto what little purpose they have left in their own lives, is a fitting through line to conclude the volume with, encapsulating the theme of change Kirkman set out to explore with The Walking Dead. The last panel we see of Shane's struggles is a particularly poignant one. As the blood seeps from his neck and his life fades, he reaches out to Rick and Carl as they embrace. The very last thing Shane sees is a father consoling his son and sharing in a heart-wrenching moment together. The very friendship and relationship Shane could have had, but threw away. It's a panel that makes one wonder if it was only in this moment that Shane realized what he had done wrong. Earlier in the issue, when holding a funeral for Amy, Donna makes a fittingly sentimental statement. "We may not have gotten along, but I loved her. I love everyone here. We all lean on each other. We all need each other." It's a sappy line that could only come from such a grim moment, a moment when someone is reminded not to take the lives around them for granted, but could very well forget again when enough time passes. And while this line could be shrugged off as such, I think it's another crucial signifier of what lies at the heart of The Walking Dead. Already, so early on in this story, a group of people have found each other and come together to help one another survive. They're living closer together than they ever would have in the old world, and naturally that creates the exact kind of soft-hearted feelings Donna has for those around her. Yet because Shane's emotional wounds were too fresh for him to hear it, he completely ignored the significance of Donna's statement, that they're all connected. They've all lost futures and loved ones and purposes, and they're all trying to hold on to what they have left in their own way, just like Shane. Dale is recovering from the loss of his wife through his friendship with Andrea and Amy. Jim is holding back a rage after losing his entire family before his eyes. Donna is holding on to her husband and 2 sons, as is Rick with Laurie and Carl. And as we'll see in the coming volumes, Glenn and Carol are yearning just as much for some form of emotional and physical intimacy. Shane had a chance to place his faith and identity and purpose in those around him, to form a community of support, but he didn't. He was so fearful of change and letting go of what was already gone that he didn't realize what he still had. It was only in his last moment did he reach out for help, not to a military soldier or a government official, but to his best friend and his son, to the fellow survivors at his side. When writing Volume 1, Kirkman ensured that if the comics failed to make a satisfactory profit, that the 6 issues still told a satisfying beginning, middle, and end. It very well could have been all we ever saw of The Walking Dead if it hadn't seen such surprise success. However, it is interesting to note that Volume 1 almost ended very differently, with Kirkman considering having Shane successfully kill Rick, and having the story follow Carl as his tension with Shane only grew over time. However, upon release the sales were better than anyone could have expected, with issue 1 selling around an estimated 8,000 copies. This saw Kirkman having enough fan mail after the very first issue that a dedicated letter hacks segment was included at the end of each issue, beginning with issue number 2, seeing Kirkman personally respond to fan theories, questions, and criticisms. By issue 6, the sales had slowly but surely grown, ensuring that the comic would at least last until issue 12. It was with this newfound success that Kirkman decided it was far too early to take Rick out of the picture, and that it could be more harmful than beneficial to readers' enjoyment. After all, he was the audience surrogate, and it was his personal fight for survival that had drawn the engagement of thousands of fans in the first place. To kill him so early would surely alienate a significant portion of the fanbase, and only make matters harder for Kirkman. And thus, The Walking Dead truly came to be what we know it as today, the Chronicles of Rick Grimes. He, from beginning to end, would be the beating heart of Kirkman's exploration of survival, change, and humanity. It was during the printing of the first 6 issues as well that Eric Stevenson, the then marketing director at Image Comics, questioned Kirkman on the lack of hints towards any sort of extraterrestrial involvement in the story. It was only then that Kirkman revealed he never had any intention of including aliens in the story, and that he only ever said that there was to get the comic greenlit in the first place. Kirkman's sly maneuvering didn't please everyone at Image, but due to the comic's undoubtable quality and success, well, there just wasn't much weight to the argument that a story like this couldn't sell anymore. By his own admission, Stevenson even acknowledged that by this point, he recognized that the story didn't need an otherworldly science fiction element for it to work, and that, if anything, it likely would have taken away from the grounded tale that Kirkman was telling. And of course, by the letter hacks for issue 7, Kirkman was already making jokes about how one day he'll jump the shark and throw aliens into the story. However, while The Walking Dead's early success paved the way for the story to find its true identity, it also unfortunately resulted in the loss of its artist, Tony Moore. To realize his vision of the zombie movie that never ends, Kirkman had intended The Walking Dead to follow a monthly release schedule, and naturally, with its rising sales numbers, there was greater pressure than ever to adhere to that schedule. Previously, it had taken Tony Moore an entire year to draw the first 6 issues, which explains their beautiful craftsmanship, but for a monthly schedule that simply wasn't a sustainable approach. The deadlines were catching up to Moore, and as he was offered other jobs with greater flexibility, he decided to step down from his role in the series. At the time, this was incredibly upsetting to Kirkman given that they had been friends since 7th grade, and he had hoped to continue their collaboration in the series. But given that a similar line of events had taken place during the run of Battle Pope, he wasn't completely surprised at this outcome either. So while Moore continued drawing the front covers for the series until issue 24, the art of The Walking Dead was about to see an entirely new face. With Moore largely out of the picture, Kirkman looked to British comic book artist Charlie Adlard, who had begun his career in the early 90s working on properties such as Judge Dredd, The X-Files, The Crow, and a handful of DC and Marvel comics. Compared to Moore, Adlard worked exceptionally fast, frequently delivering artwork not even a day after having started it. This speed undoubtedly allowed The Walking Dead to maintain its monthly schedule for the remaining 15 years of its run, and with any delays that issues did see, Kirkman almost always blamed himself, citing that he could often be too slow with his writing. While this efficiency was key to the series' consistency in release though, it's not difficult to see that Moore's level of detail was lost because of it. The year of time Moore had for Volume 1 likely gave him the room to polish and refine his work in a way that Adlard simply couldn't. Within the first few pages of issue 7, it's immediately apparent that the landscapes are more basic, the zombies aren't quite as distinct or memorable, the geography and consistency between scenes is sometimes confusing, Carl looks strangely older, and as the series goes on, it's evident that there is far less variation and depth to the characters' expressions. The cast now look meaner by nature, and sometimes come across as being plain bored or judgmental, as if they're rolling their eyes, even when they're seemingly supposed to be emoting something entirely different. And while I don't have this issue early on, a number of fans writing into the letter hacks during the span of Volume 2 were also already having trouble distinguishing some characters from others. To put it simply, Adlard's work was a little more rough around the edges. Kirkman has always been intensely defensive of Adlard in response to these criticisms, and I can understand why. Adlard is a hard and fast worker who kept The Walking Dead on track for almost its entire run, and produced a litany of iconic images and characters. His artwork is by no means bad. His use of thicker lines and intense shadows often depicts this post-apocalyptic world in just the right amount of moral grayness. In many ways, it enhances the story's horror and gives the pervasive sense that a shadow of darkness has swept the globe. Narratively and thematically, this couldn't have come at a better time either. The characters were just awoken to the idea that even the friends and family and survivors at their side can be just as dangerous as the undead, if not more. And so for the visual aesthetic of the book to take such a dark turn only complements this loss of hope and naivety that the characters have had. Because of this, it's easy to accept the change in style relatively quickly, something which could have been far more difficult if this change had come later in the book. Either way though, it is unfortunate that Moore's talents were lost. Thankfully though, his work on the front covers for the following 18 issues does give us an insight into what his version of this story would have looked like had he remained. As for the narrative itself, with the rising sales, issue 7 was the first issue Kirkman wrote with the sense that this story may continue on for some time. Kirkman's original plan for issue 7 was that it was going to be a condensed version of the entire volume, with the group coming across Herschel's farm and ultimately finding the prison at its conclusion. However, with a firm audience now on board, Kirkman had the confidence to begin expanding and exploring his story and characters in greater detail. This isn't to say the pace becomes slow by any means though. Kirkman in retrospect has even stated that he still believes he was rushing through this portion of the story. Quite a number of significant story beats are tightly packed into the 6 issues, with only 2 issues dedicated to the first major setting of the volume, the Wiltshire Estates, and only 3 issues dedicated to the second, Herschel's Farm. The latter in particular is especially fast-paced, juggling the introduction of 9 new characters that splinter into multiple relationships with the core cast. The relationship between Glenn and Herschel's daughter, Maggie, is the most apparent example of this brisk pace, where after only 3 issues and a handful of scenes together, they are already declaring their love for one another. And even though Maggie goes on to become a key character in the series much later on, her introduction is noticeably understated in retrospect, which is certainly a sign that Kirkman did not initially intend on her becoming such a key character, but the fact that she did retroactively makes her downplayed introduction all the more novel. The passing of time was also often jarring and unclear, with little sense that weeks of time have passed until a character says so. Laurie makes mention that they were staying at the farm for weeks, which is evident by Carl's healing after being accidentally shot, but in terms of the actual sequence of events and how characters refer to them, there doesn't seem to be any clear spot as to where this weeks-long time skip actually takes place. However, despite all of this, the growth in the core cast and less time dedicated solely to Rick allows for a lot more character moments and interactions. There's a noticeable uptick in the amount of dialogue and interpersonal bickering that begins to drift the story into more soap opera territory, which is not an inherently bad thing, but merely the nature of a long-form character drama such as this. However, it's worth noting that there is a distracting increase in editing errors, like there being 2 spellings for Maggie and the Wiltshire Estates, and it's always thrown me off when Rick is trying to comfort Alan by telling him that they'll have the barn cleaned up for them to sleep in a few years. Years? Shouldn't he be saying weeks or months? Why would it take years to clean this one barn? And this isn't something that was fixed for the colorized re-release of the series either, The Walking Dead Deluxe. Mistakes like these and how they slip by the production team do leave me scratching my head. Some of Kirkman's dialogue also begins to become a little more blunt at times, dragging out overt explanations of things that aren't always necessary, and sometimes seem perhaps a little too self-aware about matters, with characters' explanations of themselves making it feel as though Kirkman is speaking for the character and not that the character is speaking for themselves. It spells out too much when there could be more room for subtext and subtlety. This doesn't mean that the story lacks such things entirely though, far from it. The general development of the cast is solid and offers a deeper exploration of not just the loss of purpose these characters are facing in this new world, but the loss of trust, hope, and identity alongside it. The volume opens with one of only 3 flashbacks in the entire series. Another aspect of Kirkman's original plan for The Walking Dead was to open every volume with a new flashback, filling in the gaps on storylines and characters he thought necessary. However, in wanting to prioritize the time he had with the characters in the present, he opted to scrap this idea and stick to a strictly linear timeline, always moving forward and exploring how characters change, not changed. The flashback that opens Volume 2 though, which depicts the night that Shane and Laurie slept together, largely serves to lend greater weight to the following scene, Shane's funeral. It's an effective way to depict Laurie's development from the lonely and fearful woman that she was at the beginning of the collapse, to a woman that has grown to understand that vulnerable mental state she was in, and how Shane took advantage of that. How Shane didn't truly care for her as a human being, and only wanted her for his own selfish needs. And having been burnt from that experience, Laurie is left incredibly untrustworthy of others. And it's these darker descents of morality and perception of the world around them that gradually creeps into many other members of the group too, as their situation becomes more dire. The narrative drive for this volume is all centered around finding a new home, something that goes hand in hand with a person's purpose, whether it is their loved ones or interests or passions, is a goal, an objective. Rick's love for his family inherently presents him with such an aim, to protect them, and in order to do so, to find them somewhere safe and stable. Not to mention that, without Shane in the picture, Rick has naturally fallen into the position of leader for the group, a weight which he places on his shoulders immediately, as shown when he demands that Dale tells no one that Christmas may well be right around the corner. Attempting to keep the group alive is already enough of a task, let alone having to worry about the children losing that bit more innocence and hope when they realize that Santa Claus isn't coming. Rick's very first official act of leadership is taking away a mental burden from the group and bearing it himself. In this innate action alone, Rick makes it clear that he is a natural leader. For future reference, it is also important to note, though, that in Volume 1, Rick very briefly mentioned to Shane that if he didn't feel he needed the rest of the group, he already would have taken his family and left to go out on their own. This isn't to say that Rick doesn't care about the group. He certainly does. He's not a cruel, unsympathetic man. After all, his profession before the collapse was to protect and serve others in the community, and he was largely only considering such a thing earlier because of Shane's poor decision-making. However, it is an early sign that Rick's allegiance to this group only goes so far. Perhaps if he had had his own RV and stockpile of food and survival gear from the start, he indeed would have left Shane and the others quite some time ago. However, this is not something that Kirkman delves too deep into until later in the series. For Volume 2, Rick is firmly at the group's lead and increasingly wearing each of their troubles on his shoulders, not to mention his own. The surprising cliffhanger that caps off Issue 7 has Laurie revealing to Rick that she is pregnant, another reason as to why the volume opens with the night that Laurie and Shane slept together, planting the idea that this child is not Rick's. Rick's first response to this is a fitting one, asking Laurie what they're going to do. It's a moment of vulnerability, a moment where Rick isn't all-knowing and all-confident. But as soon as Laurie turns this question onto him, he packs away that brief human shade of insecurity and composes himself for the group, pretending as though this revelation is a joyous one and nothing but. As we see with his discussion with Dale shortly afterwards though, Rick is far from okay. Moments before Shane's death, Shane implied to Rick that there very well could have been something more going on between him and Laurie. And now with the revelation that Laurie is pregnant, Rick is left with the notion that his wife, half of his purpose for living, has been threatened by a betrayal. And if that has happened, can he continue motivating himself to protect her in the same manner that he had been? Of course, Rick hates even the idea of such a thing and simply tries to bury it, prioritizing his family and the group as though nothing has happened. Not that that avenue is much greater either, as the weight of leadership only grows heavier upon his shoulders the more homes they lose and the more desperate they become. The gated community of the Wiltshire Estates is the first potential home that the group find, presenting them with an immediate sense of relief and aspiration for the chances of their survival in this world. But this dream only lasts a single night before they discover that the community is overrun with the dead, a revelation that is memorably depicted through snow gradually dripping off of a warning sign. And if this loss wasn't enough, the group also lose their fourth member, Donna. Her dialogue prior to her death pretty obviously telegraphs her fate and how she oh so optimistically touts the Wiltshire Estates as the perfect home, and how they were all so lucky to find one another and how hopeful she is about the future. She's just a little too happy for something not to go wrong. However, while Kirkman may have overdone these lines, it does provide Donna with a nice conclusion to her development. Like what was mentioned at Amy's funeral, Donna truly did take on board Amy's optimism and changed for the better. Her only mistake was that she let this optimism override her pragmatism entirely, downplaying the threat of the zombies and getting herself killed because of it. Naturally, her death, and particularly her infectious cheerfulness immediately before her death, leaves her husband Alan utterly destroyed. So much so he wants to stay and die with her seconds after it has happened, even despite having two young sons that are still relying on him, Ben and Billy. This moment, much like with Shane, makes it evident that our purpose and our identity are one of the same. And once our purpose changes, so does our identity. And when these characters are trapped in such a brutal, unforgiving world, one that frequently punishes optimism and leaves very little to replace a lost purpose, it quickly leaves our characters feeling hopeless, depressed, and suicidal. In Volume 2, Alan, Glenn, and Herschel all attempt to act upon or make reference to the fact that they simply want to die. The pain of their losses and the lack of any apparent salvation from those losses leaves them suddenly wanting to end their life, despite having undoubtedly fought through many trials and tribulations in the old world to live for the decades that they have. Now, all of that drive and support and distractions are gone, and they're ready to give up. While this may appear on its surface incomparable to Shane's final actions, underneath I think it's the same principle. Someone's purpose is threatened or destroyed, uprooting their identity, and leading them to take an emotional, drastic action to subdue that pain. Of course, Shane was going to kill Rick instead of himself, which is far more deplorable of an action, but is that not similar to Shane experiencing a kind of death as well? After all, Rick never expected such a stark change from Shane, nor can he completely comprehend it afterwards, almost as if Shane had died and someone else took his place. Of course, I don't say this to take away responsibility from Shane or anyone else's actions though. This is purely figuratively speaking. In a literal sense, Shane is still Shane and Alan is still Alan, even in their worst moments. If it wasn't them, they wouldn't have the capability to act such a way in the first place. Who we are is how we act. But I do think that many of us can relate to the idea that sometimes, when things get heated or emotional, we may say or do something that we ourselves don't entirely like or agree with, that we don't believe is indicative of who we are. Our character and our actions are dictated by us. We act the way we do because it makes us happy or relaxed or excited, or even not for any particular reason except that it feels natural to us. We don't question it. That's just who we are. But if who we are is who we want to be, who we feel comfortable being in our actions, then how come sometimes we act in a way that we don't want to, that we disagree with, that we regret, that we feel uncomfortable with? No one's sense of character is infallible. The way we can react in a situation is often much more varied than how we would usually like to. And those ways we would usually like to form a pattern of behavior that builds our character. That doesn't mean we don't have the capacity to act outside of that pattern of behavior, but when we do, it feels like a change, or to be more dramatic, like a death. It feels wrong. Rick, for example, essentially has the same thought that I'm sure we've all heard people say about someone else. That's not the Shane I know. I can't believe Shane would do that. Or even just, that's not Shane. This is where Shane and Alan are similar. In such a brutal world, their strength of character is being tested and they are buckling under the pressure of it, just like anyone could in any intense scenario. The difference between them is how far they let their identity be warped by extreme action. Earlier, I called Shane a coward, and that's because he allowed his strength of character, his strength of identity, to crumble so completely for such selfish reasons. His actions became so severe that any goodwill his prior identity had were overwritten. He was going to murder his best friend simply out of fear for his own mental well-being, for fear of having to accept the new world he was going to live in. This is opposed to Alan, who I would call a genuinely good man. In the heat of the moment, he did want to stay and die at Donna's side, but with a little bit of Rick's help, Alan continued to fight forward. He was far from over his grieving process, but his ultimate action at the end of the day was a victory for his true character. Of course, deeming someone weak or cowardly or good or bad is entirely subjective. Some may think that Alan's moment of weakness makes him a coward, or that his harsh words to Andrea later on makes him a detestable prick and they just can't look past it. Everyone has a different threshold for when someone's actions define who they are. But to me, Alan's most important action here was that he did fight on, and even pulled Rick along with him to ensure that they both made it out of there. It's these shifting, blurry lines of identity and change that The Walking Dead plays with that help make it such a thought-provoking experience. Those little degrees of death of identity, and when that does or does not ultimately change who we are and who we want to be. How those changes mirror the same changes in the zombies themselves. Importantly, Rick and Herschel also experienced this sudden, violent test of identity. After fleeing the Wiltshire estates and being left on the road again, Carl is accidentally shot by a hunter, Otis, in the woods. When Rick is momentarily under the impression that Carl is dead, that half of his purpose in his life has been eradicated before his eyes, he flies into a rage in which he is willing to immediately kill Otis. Already, after having told Carl 4 issues earlier that killing a human being should never be as easy as killing one of the undead, Rick almost does so with barely a moment's notice. Herschel, who takes in Carl and treats him for his wound, likewise experiences this frighteningly abrupt shift in identity. After the death and reanimation of one of his own sons before the group's arrival, Herschel locked him and every other zombie he came across inside his barn. Not only is he unable to accept that his son Shaun has indeed died, but he is fearful that by killing the zombies he would be murdering helpless, sick people who could be cured. As most people likely would be in this situation, I think Herschel knows deep down that his son is dead. He all but refers to having seen him die, and his argument with Rick largely teeters off by its end because he doesn't have many plausible rebuttals to Rick's reasoning. Seeing someone so decomposed and completely unlike themselves would be more than enough to indicate that haunting loss. But at the same time, it remains a gut-wrenching situation to be in. Picture your own loved one, your closest friend, your adoring partner, your most caring family member, your innocent child, and then imagine that they were turned into such a monster. I highly doubt most people's first instinct would be to kill them and move on. How inconceivably awful would you feel if you had killed them and there turned out to be a cure? Or even if you never did learn whether there was or could be a cure or not, you may forever have that burden weighing on your mind, tormenting you, degrading your own sense of self, and possibly destroying your identity. And again, that loss of identity makes it so much easier for one to consider killing themselves. Because without a purpose, and without an identity, or feeling ashamed of one's identity, what reason is there to live? The strength behind both Rick and Herschel's arguments, between practicality and emotionality, make it a compelling beat in the story. However, once Herschel is confronted with the reality of the situation, and he is cynically punished for not wanting to kill his reanimated son so hastily, losing 2 more of his children when the zombies break out of the barn, Herschel deteriorates almost immediately. Now, to be fair, Rick is partially to blame for pushing Herschel over the edge here. After not even a day of cleaning out the barn so that the majority of the group can sleep inside it, Rick wonders why they can't just move into Herschel's house instead, now that 2 more of his children have died and there's more room. Obviously, this thought is in line with Rick's primary motivation, which is maintaining the well-being of the group. However, in what I think is a sign of his growing desperation and more strictly practical manner of thinking, Rick lacks the emotional foresight and empathy to see that it's way too soon to be asking such a thing of Herschel. Of course he isn't going to and doesn't take this well, only serving to aggravate Herschel and make it clear that Rick's stay here is not permanent. This is something Herschel made allusions to earlier, but never something he was exactly explicit about. And in the whirlwind of emotion the group has been going through, I don't blame them for missing these subtle remarks. This revelation thus leads to an argument, largely exacerbated by an emotionally desperate Laurie, in which Herschel kicks them out by threatening to kill Rick, leaving the group homeless once more. Herschel, in a matter of days, goes from wanting to save his fellow humans at any cost, to wanting to kill himself, to wanting to murder another human being. Once again, a loss of purpose leads to a shattering of one's identity. After almost killing Rick, Herschel is found alone and afraid of himself. Afraid that he's lost his mind, that he doesn't know who he is anymore. And that's a frighteningly relatable concept and an engaging story to see unfold. Although despite the resonant weight that Herschel's journey offers the storyline, the lead up to the barn massacre likely could have used a little more time to give development to Arnold and Lacey, Herschel's 2 children that are killed during the massacre, given that they barely have a handful of lines or presence in the story before their demise. As it stands, they essentially just act as stand-ins for Herschel's own development with no real characterization of their own. Amidst such expanding loss though, how do these characters continue on? How do they maintain a stable sense of identity? Well, they do so by holding on to the only thing that they have around them, each other. Alan begins to break free of his anguish when realigning his priority back to his children, a development that is neatly set up earlier in the volume when Donna is critical of Andrea's constant moping over the loss of her sister, something that Alan had since fallen victim to. We and Alan both know this isn't what Donna would want for him, so it's satisfying to see him recognize that and begin to pull through. Andrea and Dale, meanwhile, fill the void of their losses by entering a relationship with one another. The friendship between Carl and Carol's daughter Sophia deepens. Tyrese, who Kirkman introduced as a nod to the cool and capable black guy characters in Romero's Dead films, forms a relationship with Carol. This in turn leads to Glenn sparking up his relationship with Maggie, which hastily becomes so important to one another that Glenn is allowed to stay at the farm even when the rest of the group is exiled. Their relationship in particular has a rather comical but sweet bluntness to it in how swiftly they recognize everyone is pairing off and decide they might as well do it too. There's a nice scene in issue 11 when Rick and Alan discuss how nothing is easy anymore, how everything is a fight, while their dialogue is placed over Glenn and Maggie joining one another, hand in hand, to begin a relationship that becomes one of the series' longest lasting. Despite how harsh this new world is, there is still one thing that is easy. Finally, of course, there is Rick, who after almost losing Carl pours his heart out to Laurie, declaring just how deeply he loves her and how she does with him. It's frankly a beautiful moment. In these times, faced with such loss, people turn to each other. And again, it's these moments of pure human connection in the face of such darkness that humanizes this story so much. Kirkman, despite his issues with some of the pacing, does a decent job at making it feel as though our characters are getting further and further away from the old world, that they are walking deeper and deeper into the forest. On separate occasions, Laurie asks Rick, and Rick asks Dale if they think things will ever get back to the way they used to be, and none of them are sure. The only thing these three are sure of, though, is that Rick is holding the group together. The scene in issue 12 when the group sits around a campfire and Sophia says that she's still hungry, despite them being out of food, is a memorable one. In the panels that close in on Rick, there's no denying that he feels what they are feeling. He is wearing their burden and knows that the onus to protect them is on him. This swiftly leads into the discovery of the prison, a new potential home for the group, bigger and seemingly safer than anything else they've come across before. The volume concludes on this poignant moment, where despite all of their loss, how desperately they are holding on to their sense of identity and what is left in their lives, how close they are to the edge, Rick, covered in dirt, half-starved and running out of options, forces a smile and declares that it is perfect, that it's home. And despite the hope that Rick is attempting to keep alive, you can't help but find a sense of irony and melancholy in his words, and how they echoed the very same words Laurie said when they first arrived at the gates of the Wiltshire estates. Issue 13, the first issue of Volume 3, was released on October 15th, 2004, marking just over the 1-year anniversary of The Walking Dead's run. The sales numbers were now creeping up to around 15,000 per issue and rising. Even actor Simon Pegg, right around the release of his iconic horror comedy Shaun of the Dead, wrote into the letter hacks for issue 12 to express his enjoyment of the series. The Walking Dead was now attracting mainstream attention, and its success showed no signs of slowing down. As for our characters though, things were only going to get darker. As was written in Kirkman's original proposal for the series to Image Comics, the major destination that his cast of characters were going to hole up in was initially set to be a high school. However, Kirkman quickly changed this to a prison so it could act as a more striking example of how upside down the world was becoming. In the old world, jail was a punishment to be avoided even at the risk of one's own life. In the new world though, it's a home worth risking one's life for. And it's fitting that in an environment so emblematic of these differences between the old world and the new, that the characters truly begin to discover the differences they will have to adopt if they are to survive in this new world too. Also, Kirkman just thought a prison would be much cooler, and it is much cooler. Issue 13 delivers an exciting, action-packed opening that sees Rick, Tyrese, and Andrea clearing out the dozens upon dozens of undead that plague the inside of the prison. They're satisfyingly rational and smart about their approach to this, and are clearly already proficient in how they combat the zombie threat. The characters accepted the need to kill the zombies rather early on, but I think it was around issue 7 and 8 that their desensitization to it really began to set in. With the winter weather slowing down the zombies' mobilization, they weren't as great of a threat, but they were still enough of one that they needed to be taken care of. So it's natural that without a heat-of-the-moment urgency, killing the zombies as if they are a minor pest begins to become routine. It's no longer leaving as much of an impact on them. It's entirely possible too that them becoming so used to killing zombies ultimately will make it much easier for them to resort to killing living humans. After all, the physical action of that ethical dilemma has already been blurred, especially when the living humans lose so much of who they are and become just as deadly and remorseless as the undead. With the group becoming increasingly accustomed to such violence, then it's easy to see how the legitimate differences between killing a zombie and a human stops registering for them like they had yet to for Rick and Carl at the end of Volume 1. Returning to the zombies though, it's this sort of rapid desensitization to them that quickly pushes the undead into the background of the story. Of course, Kirkman was always upfront about his intentions of this being a character story, not a zombie horror one, but it is always surprising to me when remembering that as early as issue 6, there are entire issues where not a single zombie appeared. After many rereads, Kirkman's characterization and drama is so engaging and crucial to the story that I never even noticed the zombies' absence in that issue until only recently. Kirkman does at least maintain enough of their threat by having them consistently kill characters all the way till the end of the series. Especially in these first 4 volumes, he doesn't cheapen them by having them be too weak or incapable. If one grabs a hold of you, it's still an important moment the majority of the time, and the characters continue to be startled by their presence. However, it is worth noting that even though Kirkman is so outspokenly inspired by Romero's Dead films, Romero's original films always maintained a much more consistent level of fear and horror surrounding the undead when compared to The Walking Dead. Of course, in comparison, Romero's films are only films, limited to a shorter runtime and a more focused scope. They also have the benefit of being in a more tangible visual medium, with the added bonus of unsettling sound design and more detailed makeup and gore effects. For a comic book, Kirkman would have to use up many more panels to pull off that same level of tension, build-up, and horror, which is something he's simply not willing to do when it means sacrificing more time for his characters. At the end of the day, it's all a matter of presentation and perspective. In the beginning of the story, the horror was more present because that's what the characters were most consumed by at the time. In other words, Kirkman didn't really have a choice. The characters had to experience and learn why the world has come to an end, and thus the fear of the zombies had to be front and center. But as time goes on, the characters become more entangled in their own interpersonal drama, and because Kirkman doesn't have that great of an interest in actual horror elements for this story, they very quickly fall to the wayside. Like I discussed with Volume 1, I do think the horror is more present and has greater purpose throughout the entire series than Kirkman suggests, but over time his lack of priority in it does whittle down its prominence. At least no one can say Kirkman wasn't upfront about it, but I do find it a slight shame when his inspirations were always so effective in that department. Their presence was always frightening, whereas in The Walking Dead, the more scenes they have getting swiftly dispatched and eliciting less of a reaction out of the characters, the more the horror is diminished. They become ordinary. Admittedly though, this approach does make the audience become just as accustomed to the zombies as the characters, which is exactly what Kirkman is aiming for. So in that way, he did succeed. Volume 2 was also the first time the series solidified the terms lurker and roamer for the zombies. Lurkers are the ones that largely lay and sit still, not doing much until someone passes by, and roamers are, as one would expect, those that roam around, actively looking for their food. These are both cool titles, but it doesn't stop Kirkman from using the term zombies much of the time. Kirkman has since confirmed that the idea behind the Walking Dead world is that there was never any zombie fiction prior to the collapse of civilization, but that doesn't really track with the characters using the term zombie in the first place. In issue 14, Rick even mentions that they struggled to take the term zombie seriously at first, presumably because of the connotation with silly zombie films. But this isn't something we ever see the characters go through or discuss in Volume 1. They just start calling them zombies out of the blue and never question it. It's easy to see that within the first few issues, Kirkman was still attempting to maintain this idea that zombies as a fictional monster didn't exist in this world, which is a sensible way to make the characters less prepared for such an event. But by the time they start using the term, Kirkman clearly gave up on being very consistent with that idea. This sort of cut and paste, rough around the edges, inconsistent storytelling, indicative of Kirkman still trying to figure out what he wants The Walking Dead to be, is quite evident this early on in the story and continues to be so in volumes 3 and 4. One of Kirkman's most inspired additions to the zombie lore in this series though is established in issue 14. Two characters I haven't mentioned yet are Tyrese's teenage daughter Julie and her boyfriend Chris. Volume 2 frequently hints that they have some form of nefarious plan in the works. In Volume 3, we discover that plan is a suicide pact, where Chris will shoot and kill Julie in the same moment that Julie will shoot and kill Chris. Unfortunately, the pair don't have much characterization given to them outside of Chris being kind of a prick and the both of them being hopelessly in love. Their motivation behind this suicide is the naive, misinterpreted Romeo and Juliet concept that this sort of death by each other's hands is somehow tragically romantic, and will allow them to be together for all of eternity. How and why exactly they came to this conclusion isn't clear. Perhaps it is that they merely want to go out on their own terms, or it could simply be that they're just misguided teenagers. After all, teenager emotions and hormones are already so intense and complicated. Perhaps after witnessing most of the world they knew die around them, in the midst of their raging horniness, they misplaced this passion and confused themselves. Perhaps they considered that if everyone's dying, then that's how things are supposed to be. And just like their intense emotions for one another, they got in their heads that this is what they really want. Perhaps there's a kernel of young conformity here, or romanticism, or escapism, or all of it mixed into one. It's teenage naivety at its finest, and could have made for a nice area of further exploration. But either way, once the group have settled into the prison, we quickly discover that this was an awfully foolish idea, and that there is no romance in such needless violence, as Chris shoots Julie before she can shoot him, leaving her dead and him left with the awful realization of what he's done. Their stupid plan went stupidly wrong. Tyrese and Rick find the both of them shortly after, and Tyrese is naturally devastated, and in a memorable, shocking cliffhanger to the issue, when Tyrese is in a moment of pure denial over Julie's death, when he wishes more than anything that she could come back, she does, but this time trying to dig her teeth into his flesh. It's an intense sequence of events with a wild array of emotions. Rick is horrified but wants to save his friend, while Tyrese is desperately holding on to the idea that he has a second chance, that he could somehow bring Julie back to the way that she was. The motivations are so immediately identifiable and relatable that when Chris fires a bullet through Julie's head, killing her once and for all, there's just one thought everyone reading this issue has. Chris, you're gone, buddy. And gone he sure is, because not only does Tyrese kill him, but he waits until he turns again, so he can do it all over. This concept though that everyone is already infected with the reanimating zombie virus is a stroke of genius. It adds such a novel, exciting edge to the world of The Walking Dead, placing even more consequences upon violence and murder, as well as enhancing the key theme of Volume 3, death. Amidst all of the loss of purpose and identity, so comes a loss of life, an armada of death. And the fact that they are all already harboring this virus inside them only makes the world seem that bit more consumed by it. How people deal with such immense loss of life is what this volume hones in on in an engaging, varied manner. For Tyrese, his response is entirely different to Alan's. While Alan completely shut down and barely engaged in conversation with anyone, Tyrese expresses his grief through sheer violence. First, this is against Chris, of course, but then against the collection of zombies that are still pent up in the prison gym. For half an issue, the characters even think that Tyrese was killed amidst the chaos. But when Rick returns from a temporary absence, he insists that they check to make sure. Then, when they fling open the gym doors, they find Tyrese alive, sitting against the wall, completely surrounded by undead corpses. He killed every single zombie in the room without catching a single bite. His casual nature about the whole situation is amusing and relieving at the same time. This is generally the accepted moment that Tyrese became a fan favorite character. We'll discuss why he isn't one of mine when we reach Volume 4, but this moment certainly is an enjoyable relief of tension and subversion of expectations. It also makes him look plain cool, so Kirkman certainly did succeed in making him live up to the cool black guy characters from the Romero films that he was inspired by. However, what's most interesting about Tyrese's lasting response to the death of his daughter is that, on his surface, he's generally fine. The morning after her death, he's smiling again, something that Rick is of course immediately unsettled by. At that stage, Tyrese still had a lot of anger and pain to let out of his system in the gym, but afterwards, he's essentially back to normal. In an excellent scene between him and Rick, Tyrese explains that, to him, Julie's death isn't exactly a bad thing. Obviously, Tyrese would never think such a thing if she hadn't died, But perhaps one of the easier ways for him to cope with what has happened is to see the one and only positive side to it. That she no longer has to live in such a harsh world. That she's free, and he is free of the burden of worrying about her every second of every day. It's the same line of thinking that Rick found himself in when Carl had been shot. Thinking that it would be better if Carl could just sleep through all of this horror and never have to experience it. Neither of them think this because they don't care for the lives of their children, but because they do care. Because they know how unfair and awful it is for their children to have to grow up in such a vile, violent world. The fact that that even is a caring fantasy to harbor now is in itself an indicator of the kind of world they are in. A world that makes parents wish their children weren't in it. Naturally, after this, I don't think Tyrese is ever quite as driven of a character. He's often still kind and helpful, but from here on out, he largely lives for himself, knowing that his time, like everyone else, will eventually come to an end. Even despite being romantically entangled with Carol, he never attempts to try and become a father figure for Sophia. That's a part of him that has died. His process of grieving is efficient, to be sure. He lets out all of his pain in the quickest way imaginable, and moves on without much trouble. But there's a melancholy sense that because he was so quick to deem this tragedy a good thing, and never actively reckoned with his own sense of pain and guilt, that he's essentially stopped himself from ever truly being able to move beyond it. After all, he himself admits that he sees them all as good as dead anyway. Essentially, now, he just floats towards his eventual fate. In that way, I don't think Tyrese ever really did survive the death of Julie. At the same time that this storyline unfolds, Rick returns to Herschel's farm and invites them to live at the prison with them. Not only did this come at the perfect time for Herschel, as zombie attacks were only becoming more frequent and difficult to withstand, but it's also another strong signifier of Rick's wit and compassion as a leader. Not only does he look past Herschel's irrational actions and show him empathy for it, but he also knows that Herschel and his skills in farming and agriculture would be a valuable asset to their standard of living at the prison. However, barely one issue after the Green family's arrival at the prison, Herschel's two youngest daughters, Rachel and Susie, are found decapitated. This is an incredibly dark streak in the story, and almost surreal in how plain cruel it is to Herschel. Within 2 volumes, Herschel has lost 5 children. Almost all of his family is wiped out, bar himself, Maggie, and Billy. Herschel's, and particularly Maggie's, reaction to finding these little girls' bodies is plain horrifying, akin to something out of a nightmare. I do think there's an argument to make that these deaths are cheap and distasteful in the way that Kirkman gives the girls 0 development, and merely uses them as a tool for torture, but in this case it doesn't bother me so much because I do think that it is consistent with the theme of the volume, and he uses it to not only explore Herschel and Maggie's grief in an interesting, plausible manner, but also uses it as an inciting incident for a storyline that directly addresses how characters would react to something so awful happening. Its implications are far-reaching and important enough that I think it makes up for the girls' initial lack of characterization. Herschel's response to all of this is a very stern, quiet one. He shuts down in pure shock as he processes this immense loss. Maggie does much the same in how she cuts herself off from Glenn, no longer wanting a relationship because she no longer wants to feel the pain of losing someone else. For both of them, it's as if their minds are freezing in time, in the hopes that if they simply do nothing, nothing worse can happen. If they stop moving, then everything else will too. This form of disassociation is quite common amongst the characters now that death is becoming so routine. Andrew and Dale also speak to one another about how little of an emotional response they have when someone dies now, and Laurie acts much the same in later issues. While Maggie is consciously attempting to sever her emotional ties to others, I think Andrea, Dale, and Laurie are subconsciously doing the same. Of course, if one of their most immediate partners or loved ones died, they would still have more than enough emotional capacity to feel that loss immensely. These aren't cruel people who have lost the ability to feel forever, but as a sheer coping mechanism, as a way for the body to not tire itself out and expel so much energy, they are merely disconnecting themselves from their surroundings. Whether it's conscious or not, they're just not thinking at it from the same angle that they would have just weeks prior. Otherwise, of course, it would just be too much grief and pain and hopelessness to take on board all at once. Their minds, in whatever way they can, are trying to make living in this world easier for themselves. In other words, they're adapting. However, while Maggie is the most extreme conscious version of this dissociative response, Carol is the opposite. While she too is trying to comfort herself and ease her mind, her natural response is not to cut herself off from everyone else, but to strengthen her ties to them. When she is under the impression that Tyrese is dead, in her overwhelming sense of grief, she clings onto her next best relationship, that of her friendship with Laurie. So much so she kisses Laurie on the lips. Laurie dismisses this as just pure heat of the moment emotions, but as will become clear in later volumes, Carol's sense of well-being is directly tied to how robust her connections and relationships are with others. And just as how the other characters like Andrea, Dale, and Laurie are similar to Maggie, so are they similar to Carol. As we discussed in Volume 2, almost everyone is clinging on to their most meaningful relationships. That too is where the mind finds peace, what makes it easier for them to live in this world. Even for Herschel, he finds that peace not just in his children that remain, but also in his God, who he of course believes to be a being just as real as any. So what we have here is many of the characters finding themselves caught between two kinds of responses to this world, one of disconnect and one of connection. This is something everyone finds themselves doing every day, regardless of a zombie apocalypse. Living is a constant balance of what we choose to emotionally invest in or not, for our own mental well-being. And for the world of The Walking Dead, it is simply a more primitive yet heightened depiction of this balance. While much of this is passive mental action though, what about physical action? What can these characters physically do to give them relief from their pain? Well, when placed in a world so consumed by death, unfortunately, an obvious way to combat that is to deal with whatever is causing said death. For the zombies, that's easy. You kill them. For humans though? Well, wherein lies the difference? This brings us to the original inhabitants of the prison, and another element that Kirkman wouldn't have been able to implement in the same manner if this had been a school setting. The prisoners. Dexter, Andrew, Axel, and Thomas. Each of them are introduced in a humorous final panel in issue 13, where Rick and Tyrese find them lounging in the prison cafeteria like all is right with the world. Rather strangely and uncharacteristically, Rick doesn't immediately recognize that they're prisoners, even though they're clearly wearing prison jumpsuits. But their introduction into the story not only allows for a minor whodunit style mystery surrounding the murder of Rachel and Susie, but also acts as another signifier of how changed this new world is. Of course, with the murder of Rachel and Susie, the group immediately suspects the only known convicted murderer of the prisoners, Dexter. However, despite this reasonable assumption and Dale's admittedly badass initiative, there is the pervasive sense that such a suspicion could very well be turned onto anyone in their own group. Now that society has collapsed, so much of what differentiates us from one another has gone with it. Despite the obvious physical attributes that may make one more capable of pure grueling survival in this world than the other, there is no economic or class divide between anyone anymore. Everyone largely is now experiencing the same devastating event with just as much going against them. And as we have seen, even the most law-abiding citizens can turn into murderers. The array of reasons that once kept people on either side of the prison fences are gone. Now they're all on one side for one reason. They're all equals. And as equals in such a dangerous world, makes anyone a danger. Kirkman certainly could have played with the paranoia that this brings about further, but it is pretty obvious from early on that Thomas is the killer. From his suspicious tax fraud backstory to his plain creepy mannerisms, there's just not a lot of reason given to readers not to suspect him. But given that the characters are so set on Dexter as the primary suspect, given his history, it's understandable that they overlook Thomas, hammering home some of the naivety these characters still maintain about their fellow survivors. However, while all of this is taking place, Rick is surprisingly absent. In issue 15, after the death of Julie and Chris, Rick takes a motorcycle from the prison and tells Laurie that he'll return the next day, without giving her an answer as to where he's going. Over the course of the day, Rick drives his motorbike all the way back to the outskirts of Atlanta City, and returns to the grave of Shane, where he digs him up and fires a bullet through his reanimated skull. Rick's reasoning for this is that after seeing Julie turn without a zombie bite, he couldn't sleep knowing that Shane might be writhing around underground, forever trapped in his own grave. Rick makes it seem as though he felt so awful about this that he just had to do this one right thing by Shane. He even wonders if Shane would have done the same for him. Aside from that, Rick also wanted to confirm that indeed they are all infected. Regardless of how they die, they will still return as a zombie. However, while I think this is the most obvious interpretation of Rick's motivation, I don't think this is what's really going on here in Rick's mind. Up until this point, as we've seen, Rick has all but proven that he is dedicated to this group. He is wearing the weight of all of them and is clearly emotionally invested in keeping them alive. They are his purpose and formulate his identity. Anytime Rick has left the group, it's been for their betterment, whether it was to acquire weaponry in Atlanta, or returning to Herschel so he can help provide food, both things that are maintaining the group's survival. However, the idea that Rick left the group alone for a day simply because he felt bad about Shane being buried underground as a zombie isn't nearly as strong a motivation for him in my eyes. After all, not only did they just arrive at the prison, but they also discovered a group of prisoners they know next to nothing about are living there too, and Tyrese is very likely mentally unstable at this point after the death of Julie and murdering Chris, let alone him smiling about it. Essentially, Rick is leaving the group in an incredibly vulnerable time. It's not a responsible thing to do at all, and if he simply felt bad about Shane, any rational person would recognize that their own family's lives take priority over the zombified corpse of the man who tried to murder you. After all, with the last thing Rick says to Shane as he walks away, it's pretty clear he doesn't hold much sympathy for his friend anymore. So why on earth would Rick do this? Why would he leave his family so vulnerable for something that is seemingly so pointless? Well, what I think is most in line with Rick's character is that he would only do such a thing if he thought it was for the betterment of the group. And at this stage, everyone knows Rick is their leader and he is what is keeping them together. But for that to happen, Rick has to be mentally in check. He has to be focused on the group. But as we see after Julie and Chris's death, Rick can't sleep. He isn't focused, his mind is elsewhere. Yet while we know Rick doesn't care much for Shane on his own anymore, the only thing we know that is still tying Rick and Shane together is Rick's sneaking suspicion that Laurie and Shane slept together. That Laurie's coming child isn't actually Rick's. Ever since the beginning of Volume 2, it's been tearing him up inside and he's been trying his hardest to swallow it. But now that he's found the prison, a place where he finally has to make a long-term plan on how to deliver and raise Laurie's baby, that wound of betrayal is reopening. He has to face it, especially after learning that Shane's corpse is very likely still mulling around inside his grave. And because of that, he's still alive in Rick's head. He can't stop thinking about that betrayal, about that pain, about his anger. And Rick knows that if he's going to raise this child and continue protecting his family, he has to let that go. And to me, that's why Rick travels all the way back to Shane, digs him up, and puts him down. Just as he faced the worst of this wider world when putting down the bicycle girl, he now faces the worst of his personal world and puts it to rest. I don't know exactly if Kirkman in any way intended this reading of Rick's motivations here. Having him frame it in a way that he felt bad for Shane makes me think that he didn't. Originally though, Kirkman planned to have Rick say very little when confronting Shane again, and I do think that would have been for the better. If he had merely stopped after saying, "I couldn't stop thinking about it," I think that would have left just enough ambiguity and implication to make this scene perfect. This is another one of those cases where Kirkman's dialogue shows its hand a little too much. As it stands though, it is still possible to implicate this reading into Rick's dialogue. When Rick says, "Had things turned out differently, if you had killed me, I wonder if you would have just assumed being buried alive wouldn't affect me. Could you have lived with yourself? Not me. I had to set things right." It may be a stretch to some, but it's still easy enough to say that Rick isn't talking about being literally buried alive here. He's talking about, despite him having been alive in a coma, how Laurie and Shane acted with one another as if he were dead, as if they were burying him alive. And here he asked Shane that if he did live, if he would have thought about how it made Rick feel, if he could have lived with that guilt. But at the end of the day, Rick can't, and he has to set things right. He has to be able to lead and not be held back by this pain any longer. All of this isn't to say that Rick was somehow right to leave when he did though. After all, Tyrese almost died, Rachel and Susie were both murdered, and Dexter was locked in a cell all while Rick was gone. But at the same time, I think him being tormented by this affair is the strongest reason he could have for leaving when he did. As the tension consistently rises and the weight on his shoulders grows by the day, he has to cut something loose so he doesn't completely break. Once he returns to the prison, Rick is ready to lead again, and when confronting Dexter, reveals that he's even willing to kill him if he has to. The moment in which Dexter calls his bluff, daring him to open the cell door, and Rick simply opens it and stands completely firm, drenched in shadow, is just plain awesome. Rick, of course, is riddled with guilt over having been unable to stop this tragedy happening to Rachel and Susie, let alone for Herschel, Maggie, and Billy. This guilt explodes and shows its true colors when he finally catches Thomas in the act as he attempts to murder his next target, Andrea. Once Rick gets his hands on Thomas, he beats him almost to death. And the way in which he berates him over and over for killing those children, and how he does just as much harm to his own body as he does to Thomas's, is an effective depiction of Rick's inner pain and guilt over failing to be there for them. When he's hurting Thomas, he's hurting himself. It's quite overwhelming then to see how quickly the group devolves into mania, screaming and shouting at one another about whether they should kill Thomas or not. When Laurie questions Rick, it's just that bit more pressure he doesn't need. After everything he just did to let go of Laurie's affair, her challenging him makes him snap. He stops being careful with his words and his egotism comes out. He and everyone knows it's true that Rick is the leader and a good one at that, but him saying it in the way that he does isn't a good look. Ultimately though, Rick is right. What do you do with a psychopath in this situation? They have no doctors equipped to deal with the kind of mental illness that Thomas clearly has, so he would very likely need to be kept under guard and imprisoned for most of his remaining life, which would be a constant drain on the little resources and manpower that they have, let alone most people not being comfortable with the fact that he is living so close to them. On the other end though, if they let him loose outside of the prison, who's to say that he won't just come back and kill again? Their group isn't nearly big enough to keep the prison entirely secure from his re-entry, and even if they took him far away enough, he's still likely to attack anyone else he comes across. What makes this decision so impactful is that the answer to it is clear. The easiest, safest option is to execute him. It's a dilemma that excellently mirrors the same one Herschel had in Volume 2 with the zombies in his barn. Does he take the risk to lock them up beside his loved ones in the off chance that they can be cured? Or does he kill them? We saw the eventual answer to that question. And what Kirkman does so well here is bring us to that same haunting conclusion, but this time with a living human being. We're brought that one step closer to seeing the divide between killing a zombie and killing a human fade away entirely. Thomas himself doesn't even try to bargain for his life. After all, he attempted to murder Andrea in broad daylight in front of everyone without blinking an eye. In issue 18, Patricia sneaks Thomas out of his cell because she sees him as the sick person that he is, and wants to help him. But, of course, he simply tries to kill her too. So, Rick finds himself making the first spoken rule of the New World. You kill, you die. The act of murder is punishable by death. Of course, there's a strong irony to Rick saying we do not kill in the same breath that he declares that they will hang Thomas, but in this twisted world, this is Rick's twisted attempt to maintain a sense of justice. And for whatever it is worth, that kind of justice does give some form of relief to not just Rick and Herschel, but Maggie too. After Patricia tries to sneak Thomas out before his execution, Maggie shoots and kills Thomas before he can harm anyone else. For the first time since the deaths of Rachel and Susie, Maggie feels something. She feels a glimpse of relief, just as one would when killing a zombie about to bite into their skin. Rick lets Dexter free now that he's off the hook, but by this point it's too late. From Dexter's perspective, Rick's group is insane. In the short time that they've been here, 2 of them have killed themselves, 2 more were murdered, and the others immediately threw Dexter into a jail cell despite his hospitality, and Rick threatened to kill him and then never even apologized for the false accusation. To Dexter, he was a lot better off before these people ever came. So, with the help of Andrew and Patricia, and yes, Patricia isn't exactly loyal to the group when it matters at this stage, they gather all of the weapons from the prison's armory and confront Rick in a memorable tense cliffhanger to Volume 3, forcing them to get the fuck out. An interesting note to make is that, like most of the early story, Kirkman's original plan for the conclusion to Volume 3 played out much differently than how it ended up. Initially, Dexter and Andrew were simply going to leave the prison of their own accord, and the climactic reveal of the volume was going to be that Laurie wants to divorce Rick. This is why Kirkman implemented a handful of scenes depicting Laurie's gradual distaste for Rick. But by the time he reached this final issue, he simply didn't think any of these actions were natural for the characters. And with that, I agree. Despite everything, I still think Laurie loves Rick, and that the both of them have a mature enough understanding of relationships to not end it in such a time as this. All relationships go through issues, especially the longer they've gone on. But every issue that one does truly overcome, their strength grows with it. If both parties are fair and open-minded and truly loving of one another, they'll both learn and listen and grow past those issues because they know that they are stronger together. They know that they love and need each other, and Rick and Laurie are both smart enough to recognize this fact. However, this last-minute change in direction does sometimes mean that Laurie's anger ends up being brushed off with, oh, she's just hormonal from her pregnancy, which isn't exactly the most dramatically interesting excuse.
Women.
Also, Billy and Herschel have an argument which is rather jarringly chopped up in between issues 17 and 18, with so many scenes happening between them that it feels strange when Kirkman comes back to it so long later. This abrupt setup and delayed payoff with an odd warping of time is just another element of this volume that feels a little rough around the edges. But what Kirkman does succeed in is the continually burning sense that everyone is just going to explode. That this constant fighting and fear and life or death choices and consequences are all going to come to a head. And naturally, that brings us to... While Volume 4, The Heart's Desire, acts as the culmination of all of these burning characters and storylines thus far, Issue 19 surprisingly jumps away from the nail-biting action of the prison and opens with an introduction to one more character to throw into the fire. This marks the first time the series has jumped outside of the group's perspective, even if only briefly, to follow a different character, this being one of The Walking Dead's most iconic, Michonne. Originally called Michelle, Kirkman had of course intended for this dreadlock swordsman with 2 zombie companions chained at her sides to be a character in his ill-fated Dead Planet comic. After all, the fantastic stylized idea of such a character does seem fitting for a science fiction setting. However, even though Dead Planet was rejected by Image, Kirkman was still eager to realize this character in some shape or form. This was particularly the case after he had caught criticism for failing to have any particularly strong female characters. Strong in this case being literal physical strength. A female character who was just as capable as any male one, which at this point was really just Rick and Tyrese. Kirkman of course already had Andrea, who was the crack shot of the group, but he wanted someone even tougher. While he wanted to introduce Michonne as early as Volume 3, he wanted to ensure her introduction was a memorable one. An introduction that made it clear to readers that this was a character to pay attention to. And in order to do so, he wanted her to be introduced in an issue with her on the front cover. Because the covers are designed and drawn weeks, if not months prior to the issue's full release though, All of the covers up until Volume 4 had already been completed by the time Kirkman was considering her introduction, and thus Michonne's presence was delayed until issue 19, where we open the story finding this lone silent traveler walking with the hordes of the dead. Her design is instantly eye-catching and iconic. Even if it's not a conscious realization from readers, most will in some way recognize that cutting away from the core group to introduce someone like this is a unique moment, and naturally it must be important, instantly drawing our attention. Not to mention her particular lack of dialogue and her sheer confidence in using the dead like we've never seen anyone do so before, cutting their limbs and jaws off to make them docile, and using them as a shield to deflect any other zombies' attention. This new distinct layer of the world being introduced in tandem with her character adds an inherent coat of depth and intrigue to her, signaling she has a history worth pondering. Her first action in the story is saving Otis outside of the prison fences after he returns from the farm after a lengthy absence. Using both her katana and a shovel, she single-handedly wipes out well over a dozen zombies. And with Adlard's on-point drawing, you can just feel the thud of that shovel hitting the ground after she's finished. It's pretty damn metal. As a side note, Kirkman originally intended Michonne to be pronounced Michonne, but after the TV show, the name has retroactively become universally accepted as Michonne, with even the Telltale game eventually using said pronunciation, despite still existing within the world of the comic. Not to mention this pronunciation just being more in line with its spelling. Either way, one could worry that Kirkman flipping around where Michonne was initially supposed to be introduced could lead to her appearance ultimately being rather irrelevant to the surrounding plot. But thankfully, she very quickly ends up playing a key role in the core conflict of this volume. All of this is set off, of course, though, with Rick and how he deals with the threat of Dexter, who has him held at gunpoint with no clear means of salvation. Lucky for Rick, though, before Dexter can force him and his group out of the prison, a litany of zombies pour out of A Block, where Andrew and Dexter had just acquired the guns in the first place. And a setting which Kirkman had cleverly already established wasn't cleared out by the group, and now that the entrance has been opened, it's entirely plausible of a way to throw Rick a moment of relief. As they all attempt to fend off the hordes of the undead, Rick even saves Dexter from one of them, attempting to find a sense of common ground between them. He's giving Dexter a chance. But Dexter literally spells out that changes nothing. Smart man would have let it get me. And a smart man wouldn't have said that, because this is exactly when Rick decides he's going to kill Dexter. And frankly, there couldn't be a more justifiable situation for Rick to do so. Rick's group have been far from perfect, but even after their discovery of who Thomas truly was, they didn't throw Dexter or Andrew to the wolves. Despite outnumbering them, they allowed them to stay and took strides in making the prison more hospitable for all of them. Axel had even assimilated into the group rather well and defended them against Dexter, which does lead to a funny call-out in which Dexter mocks Axel's recurring tendency to end most sentences with, "You follow me?" Through Axel, it's clear that these groups can coexist together, but Dexter is willing to throw all of them, including their children, out into the wild. And after everything Rick has seen and done, he's just not going to let that happen. And as a leader, a husband, a father, and a human being, nor should he. So amidst the chaos of blood and gunfire, Rick shoots one bullet right through Dexter's head. He murders his first living human being. And honestly, with all of the reasonable motivation he has, and after having done so much worse to the undead humans, it honestly doesn't feel too surprising of a scene. And I think that's where the weight of this moment lies. Kirkman has taken us on a realistic journey through a world that makes even its readers feel as though murder is a valid, humane option. And even more striking is that Rick has done so with as little indifference as he would have with a zombie, serving as an excellent demonstration of just how far Rick has come from the beginning of this story. Already, 19 issues in, Rick has travelled so far and away from the Rick we knew in issue 1, murdering another human being without so much as a second thought. And as Patricia cries over Dexter's body, I truly love Adlard's use of shadow shrouding Rick's expression as he delivers Kirkman's cold as ice line, "Cry me a river." The issue concludes with a thoughtful scene between Tyrese and Rick, in which they recognize that Rick's "you kill, you die" rule has already proven to be ill-fitting for this world. In knowing that Kirkman didn't intend for Dexter and Andrew to go down this path, it's not surprising that he also didn't intend for Rick's "we do not kill" speech to be overwritten so soon after making it. But in hindsight, I think it works wonders. Once the question of how to deal with killers and killing enters the group's consciousness, it's natural for them to cycle through the various options rather rapidly. By choosing to kill Thomas, they were already one step away from this kind of murder anyway, so it only makes sense that it wouldn't take them long to begin to realize that killing was going to have to be necessary in more than one case. The final panel of the issue, in which Rick acknowledges this reality, is another beautiful piece of work from Adlard. Its contrast between the bright lights and Rick's solemn expression perfectly capture his state of mind, his awareness of this being both right and terrible. Of course though, what's important about this beat in the story is that Tyrese is the only one that saw Rick commit the act. To everyone else, Rick pretends as though a stray bullet is what killed Dexter, knowing that if he betrayed his own "you kill, you die" rule so soon after making it, that his leadership and his intentions would have been questioned, although lying to them all will eventually prove to be just as problematic. All of this being packed into a single issue is also quite representative of this volume's pacing overall, which is perhaps the series' best since Volume 1. While Days Gone By's pace was especially tight, its more honed-in focus on only a select few characters made it work, but it's also not indicative of how the rest of the series will be handled when the cast and Kirkman's focus grows so significantly. Volume 2 is perhaps a little too fast at times, and Volume 3 can be choppy, but Volume 4 maintains a strong balance of significant character development alongside a pacing and sequence of events that almost never lets up. This is a dense yet consistent volume. Admittedly, there are a couple of elements that are questionable, such as an entire scene dedicated to Andrea rather plainly explaining how she's going to start cutting up the prison jumpsuits to make new clothes. This was intended by Kirkman as a setup for the characters eventually wearing more and more unique clothing, akin to the Mad Max films. But because he ultimately dropped this ambition and kept the clothing rather grounded and streamlined throughout the series, this scene is just left acting as more of a menial, routine detail about how they'll go about dealing with clothing, which isn't too interesting of a plot point. Also, Volume 4 is where we begin to see Kirkman struggling with balancing such a large cast. Maggie's attempt to cut off Glenn is short-lived, realizing that if she's going to die like everyone else, she might as well live her life with the ones she loves, which is a nice conclusion for her to come to and reiterates the wholesome, simple nature these two's relationship offers the story, but this hitch in their relationship being resolved after only 2 scenes together isn't exactly the most satisfying. More importantly though, there is Alan, who after the loss of Donna garnered a great lot of focus in Volume 2, making him a likable, valued member of the cast. But while his development is still present and takes on a natural progression in Volumes 3 and 4, his focus is noticeably diminished. He begins to fade into the background. It's only natural for any writer to struggle with balancing this large of a cast, and Kirkman generally does a decent job at it. But this is a common fate many of his characters have as the series goes on. Their early days are full of life, development, and promise, but then they fade away so much that it makes one wonder why they're still around at all, which is a shame because I really like characters like Alan. His story of grief and overcoming it is a satisfying, empathetic one. However, this sort of inconsistent focus for side characters happening so early in the series' run says to me that Kirkman's The Walking Dead isn't really an ensemble story. At the end of the day, this is Rick's story and the focus is primarily on him and whoever is most important to him at any given time. I do at least applaud Kirkman's attempts to give a decent level of characterization to such a large cast though, which is enough to form a well-rounded group that readers feel like they are plenty familiar with. None of them are one-dimensional, and that in itself is quite a triumph. Even continuing through Volume 4 are a number of other satisfying developments and character moments, such as Axel and Herschel growing to like one another, and Herschel's sweet moment of acceptance of both Maggie and Glenn. Kirkman has alluded to the fact that the decision to kill Alan off was a last-minute one, likely because eventually he too recognized that he had largely fallen out of importance in the story. Either way, it's fitting that Alan's final act in the story is an offering to help Rick. Piece by piece, in the last 2 volumes, Alan has helped the group in small ways off in the sidelines, whether it verbally or physically. But now he's stepping up to help them face the undead in the front line as they attempt to clear out whatever zombies remain in A Block. He's a little inexperienced and jumpy, of course, but the fact that he is trying is admirable. But unfortunately, Alan has never been the fittest member of the group, and his failure to remedy that sees a zombie sneaking up behind him as he's taking a breather. Once he's bitten, Alan immediately flies into a panic, which sees Rick facing yet another horrifying split-second decision to make. Rick, of course, decides to take the one which very well could save Alan's life, to cut off his leg in the hope of stopping the infection before it can reach the rest of his body. Tyrese, Dale, and Axel are all so shocked by this idea that they're almost completely helpless. Tyrese in particular is adamantly opposed to the idea, but Rick's line of thinking, despite it being in the heat of the moment, makes sense. Rick is the only one out of the 4 using his wits to try and fight for Alan's life, nor does he ask anyone else to do the dirty work either. He puts aside his own pain and horror over the situation and acts to save a friend. Tyrese, though, after seeing this and Rick murdering Dexter, begins to suspect that this act of Rick's was less out of selflessness and care for Alan, and more out of some sort of sick sadism. Tyrese had already comforted Rick over killing Dexter, and all but agreed with him on that decision. So here, I think Tyrese is beginning to project his own guilt-ridden feelings over the violence he has committed. He's attempting to make himself feel better by twisting around his own insecurities that he is a violent, sadistic man, and putting the blame on Rick. Then, on the same day, Tyrese also selfishly succumbs to Michonne's seduction and allows her to please him sexually, despite still being partnered with Carol, who happens to catch them in the act. And this, everybody, is where everything finally explodes. Carol, up till this point, had already been established as someone who was rather emotionally frail. When she doesn't have someone looking after her, she clings onto whoever she can. Thus, the discovery that Tyrese has betrayed her trust affects her so deeply and quickly that soon after their breakup, she slits her wrists in an attempt to kill herself. It's a shocking image when Rick and Laurie find her bleeding out and Sophia curled up in the corner of the cell, frightened out of her mind. The way the image doesn't even show Carol except for her sliced open wrists, and Sophia's fear, leaving just that bit more to the imagination, only makes the moment more unsettling. At the same time that this happens, Michonne attempts to seduce Tyrese again, and he gives in right when Rick finds them to tell them the news of what has happened. Up until this point, the little that we have learnt about Michonne is the most we will learn about her for the vast majority of the novel. Which is that, like everyone else, she has lost a lot. Most importantly, 2 children of her own. In her quiet manner and the way that she talks to her ex-boyfriend as if he is still alive, makes it apparent that she is a deeply scarred woman. Initially, her seduction of Tyrese makes her a rather morally dubious character, but the genuine worry she has when hearing about Carol is a small yet likable sign that she does have an empathetic heart buried somewhere beneath her cool and cold exterior. Tyrese is understandably hurt and shaken by this revelation, wrestling with his own guilt almost immediately. However, this is where Rick's temper once again gets the better of him, and this time in a way worse than ever before. I think here Rick is seeing a few things. Firstly, he is seeing adultery, the same kind that he experienced with Shane and Laurie, the same kind he was so hurt by and so desperate to move on from. He knows exactly the sort of pain that Carol is feeling, and here he has a chance to say the things that he never could to Shane. Secondly, acting as a kind of extension of that, Rick is seeing the same sort of indifference that Shane had for the group in Tyrese. Rick has no doubt done more and harbored more weight than anyone else for this group. He has been the one forced to take the brunt of every blow from every threat to the group, deal with every mistake him or someone else makes, wear the guilt and pain and horror of every decision. Even in the face of doubt and judgment, Rick has persevered. He has remained firm and confident as their leader despite the absolutely immense responsibility he has, and personal pain he has had to bury. He formulated their plans, he found them their home, he killed the dead, he secured their food, and he murdered another human being for them. But here, he sees someone being entirely flippant about the emotions of others in the group. Someone being careless and fooling around in a time when people's lives are more fragile than ever. Amidst the loss of so much purpose, identity, and life, here is someone stepping on that. Tyrese, for pure sexual pleasure, is putting himself before the group, and that is the polar opposite of Rick. Thirdly and finally, I think Rick too is projecting his own guilt. When someone takes up leadership like he has, and holds the lives of these people in his hands, in his decision making, he can't help but feel responsible for one of them when they get hurt or killed. And there's been so much of that pain that it's only expected that it would take its toll on Rick. It's guilt after guilt after guilt, over and over. And so here, he can also finally let out what he's been thinking of himself, much like with Thomas. And with this hefty blend of intense emotions, Rick loses it. He lets out all of his frustrations and anger and pent-up adrenaline with no concern as to how Tyrese would respond, even going so far as to bring up Julie, which is pretty obviously the worst thing Rick could do in this moment. So Tyrese responds in equal anger, flying into a rage that sees him repeatedly beating upon Rick. This scene honestly becomes so wrought with anger and testosterone that it becomes comical. Rick just doesn't shut up and says every possible thing to make the situation worse, eventually calling out Tyrese for what he did to Chris. This was a low blow for Rick considering he had already consoled Tyrese over murdering Chris and agreed with his actions. But at the same time, Tyrese had just beat the shit out of Rick and then called him insane. At this point, it's two angry, pent-up men letting out everything, and it carries on like the infamous They Live fight scene. And for that, it's pretty enjoyable. Tyrese then goes on to admit just how savagely he tore Chris apart. Tyrese, in one of his earliest scenes in Volume 2, told Rick how he unintentionally killed a man when saving Julie from being raped. He beat him to death, killing somebody long before Rick ever did. Tyrese explains how he never felt bad about it, and sees this as another example of the new world changing who he is. Although I don't know if Tyrese would have felt much different had he done the same before the collapse. I don't think many fathers would. Protecting their child from a crime so vile as rape is as strong a motivator as any. However, after the death of Julie, Tyrese did mean to kill Chris, and once he had, he claims to have mutilated him in such abhorrent ways that not only he isn't ashamed of, but actively enjoyed. Chris, just like the man who attempted to rape Julie, both deserved these deaths. But it does form a violent pattern for Tyrese, where once he turns his sights against someone, he doesn't hold back. And now he's doing the same to Rick, continually beating him even though Rick hasn't actually laid a finger on Tyrese. And even despite this, Tyrese then goes on to flat out accuse Rick that he enjoyed killing Dexter and chopping off Alan's leg. I think this is pure projection from Tyrese's end, fearful and torn up about the fact that he enjoyed the violent torture he inflicted upon Chris. This is the reason Tyrese isn't really a favourite character of mine, like he is for many others. He's certainly got his cool and likeable moments, but after the death of Julie, he does become rather selfish in his treatment of Carol and Rick. Even if Rick's acting just as foolishly here, I think the core of Rick's opinions are stronger than Tyrese's. Tyrese became self-absorbed and dangerously ignorant of how fragile their lives are now, all so he could sleep with someone he barely even knew. Their argument eventually tumbles into them both accusing each other of being murderers, something Rick is in denial over admitting. He's torn between the lines of justice and crime, and his rule of you kill, you die. Despite having killed Dexter and knowing it was the right call, he hasn't quite accepted that it was murder and that he's some kind of killer. He's still attaching an old world negative connotation to it, when in this world it's a little more complicated. Rick of course only fights back when Tyrese calls his true motivations into question though, when Tyrese implies that Rick doesn't care about the group. Rick and the reader know that that just isn't true, and for Tyrese to even think such a thing is rather short-sighted of him. After all, one of Rick's earliest actions as a leader was risking his life at the Wiltshire estates to go after Tyrese, Julie, and Chris, and make sure that they got out alive. Rick's final line to Tyrese, while overly provoking like everything else they've said to one another, rings the most true. Everything I did for the good of this group. You can't say that. That's what makes me right. Then, just to make this insane culmination of events even more gripping, Alan finally dies in his sleep. And in a true show of his character, Rick puts aside his personal matters and pain, stumbles to his feet, climbs the stairs, and puts Alan down so no one else has to. It's an enthralling moment depicting not just Rick's true colors, but the sheer unbearable weight of what he has to deal with. Again, the deep shadows return and douse his face in darkness, emblematic of the pain he is going through and his attempts to conceal that from the rest of the group. But, like anyone, he has a breaking point. It's a fitting mirror to the first issue of the comic that issue 24 opens with Rick waking from a small coma. Except this time he's not awaking to the realization that the world is dead, but that they are dead. Before he can explain this newfound perspective to the group though, Dale informs Rick that there has been a change in leadership. No longer will Rick remain the sole leader. Instead, they have formed a committee made up of Rick, Tyrese, Herschel, and Dale. Quite evidently, there is no female on the committee, something that the characters directly reference and Dale attempts to explain away as, the women just want to be protected. This is one of a few matters dealing with female characters that Kirkman, in retrospect, regrets. In Volume 1, there is a scene between Laurie, Carol, and Donna that, while doing the laundry for the group, Donna brings up how unfair it is that the men do all of the hunting and the women do all of the chores. She vocalizes a frustration that this sort of conservative division and reassignment of labor will harm the prospect of women's rights in the future. Laurie, though, shuts this down as just the need to be realistic in a time of survival. Kirkman has since stated he likely would have had male characters joining in on their laundry duty if he had written the scene today, and finds the entire exchange rather cringeworthy. I wouldn't be surprised if Kirkman finds the scene so off-putting because he knows that his younger self wrote this scene with a typical young man's quasi-misogynist perspective. A sort of, shut up complaining women, just be happy doing the laundry and let the men do the men's work. I don't know if that in any way was Kirkman's conscious or unconscious line of thinking back then, of course, but it would make sense as to why Kirkman feels so off about the scene nowadays. After all, he knows himself far better than anyone else, and perhaps he wouldn't feel so strongly about the scene nowadays if he knew his younger self wrote it with a squeaky clean, progressive mindset. Either way though, I do think the scene works in retrospect as a prelude to the growth that the female characters have throughout the story. What Donna was fearful of does, in a way, come to fruition here when multiple men ultimately hold the power over the women. However, as the series unfolds, these more archaic ideals fade away and are overcome by the relevance, power, and strength that the female characters gain throughout the story. After establishing this stereotypical idea of what women are only good at, the female characters eventually more than prove that they are so much more than those traditional limitations of their gender. So even if unintentional, these setbacks for women's rights act as a solid setup for how far they come by the end of the story. When everything falls apart, so does a form of their equality, but as they ultimately persevere to build a better world, that equality is reinstated tenfold. And the fact that I think this element of the story ends up working in the way that it does, is also a sign of Kirkman's own eventual growth as a writer and an adult. Regardless of how one may perceive the gender of those in the committee though, it is a smart move for the group to bring themselves a little closer to a democratic system. As they had clearly seen, leadership in such a time can be far too much of a burden for one person to carry. Naturally, with word out that Rick had indeed murdered Dexter, they too were worried about Rick's decision-making abilities and how honest and loyal he would be to his own word and rules that he expects everyone else to follow. The funny thing about Rick here is that he does seem to agree with the idea of reassigning power from him as an individual to the hands of a few. But in so many words, he basically goes on to stomp on a lot of the intention behind this democratic shift in leadership. As most of the group work together outside, planting seeds for the coming summer, Rick arrives to say his piece. Laurie smiling at seeing him awaken is a sweet little detail, a sign of a shift in their relationship, a calm after the storm, their connection remaining firm and wholesome at its core. It is here though in the final pages of Volume 4 that Rick delivers one of the most important speeches in the series. Tyrese, despite being the one to beat Rick so thoroughly that he was unconscious for over 24 hours, won't apologize to him until Rick does so first, and holds this idea over Rick that he's gone over the deep end in having killed Dexter and is threatening their humanity by having done so, threatening their path to the old world. To me, this is just another layer of Tyrese's projection. Since the argument, he's likely been feeling continual internal pressure over his actions, and is conflicted about having murdered other human beings, so much so that he is desperate to find some moral high ground over Rick and alleviate his own self-guilt by doing so. Essentially, he's virtue signaling. However, while Tyrese is still in this argumentative mindset, Rick, after having let out all of his remaining guilt and fear over what they've done, has finally accepted the truth of this new world. He has shed away his innate desires to maintain the same sense of morality and rule of law from the old world, and finally come to the overly pessimistic and cynical perspective that the old world is never coming back, and that changes everything. Rick mentions that it's been almost a year now since the collapse, which is another aspect of the timeline that doesn't quite seem to line up, but either way, it's clear by this point that the world belongs to the hordes of the undead now. Rick, who once shared these worries in private with Shane, is no longer afraid to tell everyone that there is no rescue coming, there is no salvation. The lives, purposes, and identities that they had in the old world are, as he says, gone forever. Now they're surrounded by death, they're consumed by it, it's in their blood and outside their walls, waiting every second of every day for the moment that their hearts stop beating or the brief instance that they drop their guard. And this new world is no longer new, it's just the world, and that world is against them. It has been tearing away who they are piece by piece, just as the zombies do with their flesh. For all intents and purposes, the humans left in this world are pretty much dead already, marching towards one singular fate. They are the Walking Dead. Yes, now clap for the title drop, everybody. But here, Rick wants the group to understand that they aren't simply living to live anymore. They're surviving to live and living to survive. The only way for them to hold back the inevitable fast-approaching fate of death in this world is to fight. This world doesn't play by the old rules anymore. It destroyed them. To reprimand Rick for killing Dexter doesn't make sense because there is no greater society to even have stopped Dexter from doing what he did in the first place, let alone punish him afterwards. Dexter wasn't abiding by those old rules, and neither should Rick. His act of killing was the only thing keeping their lives inside these walls intact. The volume's title, The Heart's Desire, on its surface is a reference to the romantic and sexual desires which set the storyline's final conflict into motion. But I find its greater meaning to be in reference to everyone's heartfelt desire to hold on to the old world, to hold on to their once accepted rules and morality. Even Rick wanted to hold on to them so badly that it tore him up inside when he knew he couldn't. But now, after so much loss, the only way to avoid it is to lose one more thing. To lose that line of morality that the rule of law used to maintain. If they are to survive now, they have to realize that it isn't always you kill, you die in this world. Sometimes it's you kill, you live. Of course, taking a cue right from the undead monsters that rule this world now. Once again, those differences between the dead and the living blur just that little bit more. Another step through the dark forest that makes them that much more dissimilar from who they once were. And that much more the Walking Dead. It makes a moment of relieving tension and acceptance that much more melancholic and tragic. Clearly, this is a dense speech, one that is perhaps a little wonky in execution, with Rick's vagueness over the Walking Dead line and the way he stumbles from point to point, making him sound a little more erratic than impactful at points. But after Kirkman's meticulous build-up over the prior 4 volumes, this moment has been a long time coming. From the loss of purpose in life, to the loss of identity, trust, and hope, to the sheer loss of life, now comes Rick's answer to it. Rick's acceptance and realization that in order to stop this endless loss from taking what little they have left, they have to lose their heart's desire to maintain their old rule of law and be willing to do anything to survive now. They will undoubtedly still maintain as much of their sympathetic qualities as possible, their compassion, empathy, and supportiveness for one another, but they also can't allow that to hinder their ability to fight and act when they need to be what they once would have called savages. Of course, this speech is a little threatening to the idea that their decision-making is supposed to be more democratic now, because Rick could very well disregard any majority vote if he disagrees that it's the best choice for their survival. But ultimately, he is right. Rick's sheer strength of confidence in this position too, I think largely renders the new committee obsolete already. They know he's ahead of the curve, and out of all of them, has the strongest will to persevere through the trials and tribulations of leadership. He's done it before, and he'll continue to do so. Despite his flaws, he is still a truer leader than any of them. And therein lies the conclusion to the first 4 volumes of Kirkman's epic, The Walking Dead. It is a powerful, effective, and engaging inspection of what happens when humans lose so much around them, the pain, fear, and anger it causes, and how that warps us from everyday law-abiding citizens to people that are willing to murder one another. Our purpose, intricately tied to our identity, can only take so much of a beating before our instincts kick into gear and our actions to maintain what we have left become more and more drastic. It's a survival instinct that is all but necessary for the world Kirkman has created, a world that is built to take. Kirkman captures the complexity, frailty, horror, and beauty of humans in this story, as well as one of our simultaneously most frightening yet admirable qualities, our strength to overcome and adapt. And this loss of morality and rule of law for the sake of maintaining our purpose and identity in life is a wonderfully rich state of mind to explore, one that only becomes more dark, complex, and meaningful as time goes on, one that poses a question for the rest of the series. When sacrificing your morality for the sake of your purpose and identity in life, when does that identity and purpose become something else entirely?